The city of Konya in the 13th century was not merely a point on a map. It was a crossroads of empire, commerce, and ideas, a place where the dust of caravan routes settled upon the marble of great mosques and the humble stone of market stalls alike. Imagine the bustling bazaars, the clatter of wooden carts, the scent of spices mingling with the distant echo of the Seljuk court. It was here, under the shadow of the Seljuk Sultanate, that the great poet mystic Jalal al-Din Mu*125 ad Rumi was born, a man whose lineage traced back to a family of jurists and theologians, a lineage that had long served as custodians of Islamic law in the province of Rum. His father, Baha al-Din Walid, was a respected scholar of Shafi jurisprudence, a man who taught at the madrasa of the great Seljuk vizier Sa'd al-Dawla. In that household, the Quran was recited with the same regularity as the call to prayer, and the study of fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence, was as natural as breathing. Yet the world outside the family walls was shifting in ways that would soon reverberate through Rumi's own heart. The political climate of the time was a tapestry woven with threads of both stability and turbulence. The Seljuk Empire, though powerful, was beginning to fracture under internal disputes and external pressures. The once stable trade routes that had brought silk from the east and glassware from the west were now threatened by the relentless advance of the Mongol hordes. In 1241, a contingent of Mongol cavalry swept across Anatolia, their horses kicking up clouds of dust that seemed to blot out the very sun. The Seljuk ruler, Khosrow II, found his armies unable to halt the tide, and the very walls of Konya trembled with the news of the approaching threat. For the scholars and mystics of the city, the Mongol invasion was not simply a military event. It was a profound reminder of impermanence, of the fragile veneer that separates order from chaos. Rumi, who had spent his early years immersed in the study of law, felt the foundations of his world shift as surely as the ground beneath his feet. Another, more subtle, impact of the Mongol incursions was the displacement of countless scholars, poets, and mystics who fled the devastation of their homelands. The intellectual climate of the Islamic world was, at that moment, a mosaic of ideas traveling along the same routes that caravans used to transport silk and spices. When the Mongols razed the great libraries of Nishapur and later, in 1258, Baghdad, the surviving scholars carried with them manuscripts, commentaries, and oral traditions, scattering them across the Persianate world. Even before the fall of Baghdad, the tremors of the Mongol advance reached the courts of Anatolia, prompting an influx of refugees into Konya. In the evenings, Rumi would sit in the courtyard of his father's lodge, listening to the whispered recitations of the Quran in Persian, the verses of Hafiz, and the theological debates of the displaced scholars. The very presence of these exiles infused the city with a sense of urgency, a feeling that the divine mystery was being pressed upon by the temporal world, a tension that would later find expression in Rumi's poetry as the dance between the eternal and the fleeting. It was within this crucible of political uncertainty and intellectual cross-pollination that Sufism, Islamic mysticism, found fertile ground to flourish. The Sufi path, with its emphasis on inner experience, love, and the direct encounter with the divine, offered a sanctuary from the external chaos. While the jurists of the madrasa focused on the outward observance of Sharia, the Sufis turned inward, seeking the hidden meanings behind the law. In the early 13th century, the Sufi orders, or tariqas, began to coalesce around charismatic masters who combined rigorous spiritual discipline with poetic expression. One of the most influential of these masters was the Andalusian mystic Ibn al-Arabi, whose concept of Wahdat al-Wujud, the unity of being, proposed that all existence is a single, unfolding reality of the divine. Though Ibn al-Arabi would not meet Rumi in person, his ideas traveled along the same routes as the refugees, and his writings would later echo in the verses of the Konya poet. Another towering figure whose thought shaped the intellectual landscape of Rumi's time was the Persian theologian al-Ghazali. In his seminal work I letter 1e25 ya macron letter 2b letter 2bf ulu macron m al-din, The Revival of the Religious Sciences, al-Ghazali attempted to reconcile the outward practice of Islam with the inward quest of Sufism. He argued that the mystic's experience was not a departure from orthodoxy, but a deepening of it. Al-Ghazali's emphasis on the purification of the heart, the importance of intention, niyyah, and the role of the Sharia as a scaffold for the soul's ascent resonated strongly with the scholars of Konya, who were searching for a way to integrate the legalistic tradition of their ancestors with the ecstatic yearning that Sufism evoked. Against this backdrop, the story of Rumi's encounter with the wandering dervish Shams-e Tabrizi reads like a sudden flash of lightning across a darkened sky. It is a story that has been retold in countless gatherings, each time with a slightly different hue, but the core remains vivid. One evening, as the market of Konya swelled with the chatter of merchants and the clamor of buyers, Rumi, then a respected jurist and teacher, was strolling among the stalls, his mind perhaps still tangled in the legal debates of the day. In the midst of the crowd, a figure emerged, tall, with a disheveled beard, eyes that seemed to hold a universe within them. Shams, a dervish from Tabriz, was known for his unconventional behavior, his disdain for formalities, and his relentless pursuit of the divine through paradox. The first exchange between them has become legend. Some tell us that Shams approached Rumi and, without preamble, slapped him across the face. The sudden impact startled the jurist, and the market fell silent for a heartbeat. Shams then whispered, "You are a man of law, but your heart is a cage." Rumi, stunned, felt the walls of his scholarly rigor crumble. He later recounted this moment in his Divan-e Shams with the words, "When the beloved's fire struck my heart, the world turned into ash." The encounter was not merely a meeting of two individuals. It was a collision of two worlds, one grounded in the external discipline of jurisprudence, the other soaring in the boundless realm of love and divine intoxication. In the days that followed, Shams became Rumi's spiritual companion, his mentor and his mirror. Their dialogues, often recorded in Rumi's poetry, were riddled with riddles, paradoxes, and a shared laughter that seemed to echo the very breath of the divine. Yet the path they walked together was not without danger. The Seljuk court, while tolerant of Sufi practice, was wary of any influence that might disrupt the delicate balance of power. Moreover, the constant threat of the Mongols loomed like a storm cloud. In 1243, a devastating earthquake struck Konya, shaking the city's foundations and causing widespread destruction. The ground opened, the minarets of the great mosques cracked, and the cries of the wounded filled the air. In the aftermath, Rumi climbed onto the steps of the ruined mosque, his voice carrying over the rubble, and delivered a public sermon that would be remembered for generations. He spoke, "The earth trembles, my brothers, but the heart must remain still. For when the world collapses, the love within us becomes the only solid ground." He invoked the Quran, saying, "Indeed, with hardship comes ease," and reminded his listeners that the trembling of the earth was a reminder of the transitory nature of all worldly structures. This sermon, recorded by his disciple Hussein, not only comforted the traumatized populace, but also illustrated how Rumi's worldview had been reshaped by the twin forces of natural disaster and the looming Mongol threat. He began to see the world as a dunya, a fleeting stage, where true permanence lay only in the divine love that could not be shaken. The Mongol invasions, though often recounted as distant military campaigns, left an indelible imprint on Rumi's philosophical outlook. First, the sheer scale of destruction forced him to confront the fragility of human institutions. When the Mongol horsemen swept through Anatolia, they razed towns, burned libraries, and scattered scholars like leaves in a storm. Rumi witnessed the loss of learned men, the burning of books that contained centuries of knowledge, and the disintegration of the scholarly networks that had sustained his own education. In response, he wrote, "The fire that devours the parchment also burns the ego, leaving the soul bare before the beloved." This metaphor reflects a shift from a focus on external knowledge to an internal, spiritual illumination, a hallmark of his later poetry. Second, the existential threat posed by the Mongols heightened Rumi's sense of urgency regarding the spiritual path. He began to emphasize the immediacy of divine love, urging his followers to seek the beloved before the world could be swallowed by the sword. In a letter to a disciple he wrote, "Do not wait for the next sunrise, for the night may fall without warning." This sentiment mirrors the Sufi concept of zuhd, detachment from worldly concerns, yet it is infused with a pragmatic awareness of the political realities of his time. The Mongol raids, therefore, acted as a catalyst that transformed Rumi's intellectual trajectory from a jurist's measured deliberation to a mystic's passionate urgency. These historical currents intersected with the teachings of earlier Sufi masters, creating a rich tapestry of ideas that Rumi would weave into his own work. Ibn al-Arabi's notion of Wahdat al-Wujud found resonance in Rumi's poetry when he declared, "I am the lover of the lover, and the lover's lover is the beloved." Al-Ghazali's insistence that the outward law and the inward path must be harmonious echoed in Rumi's assertion that the law is the hand that guides the heart. But the heart must still dance. By integrating these influences, Rumi crafted a unique synthesis that honored his jurist heritage while embracing the ecstatic love of Sufism. Yet not all scholars have accepted Rumi's place within the philosophical canon. Some, like the modern academic Franklin D. Lewis, argue that Rumi should be primarily understood as a poet, a master of lyrical expression whose verses capture the emotional landscape of love, rather than a systematic philosopher constructing metaphysical arguments. Lewis points out that Rumi's works lack the formal structure of traditional philosophical treatises. His Masnavi reads as a series of stories, parables, and anecdotes, each designed to stir the heart rather than to delineate a logical system. He asks, can we call a poet a philosopher when his primary aim is to awaken the soul through metaphor, rather than to reason through abstract concepts? This critique invites us to consider the very definition of philosophy. Is it limited to rigorous argumentation, or does it also encompass the profound exploration of existence through poetic insight? Opposing this literary-centric view, other scholars such as the Persianist Sayyid Hassan Nasser contend that Rumi's mysticism, while beautiful, risks diluting the doctrinal purity of Orthodox Islam. They argue that Rumi's frequent use of metaphor, referring to God as the beloved, or describing the soul's yearning as a lover's ache, may lead followers to a pantheistic interpretation that blurs the distinction between creator and creation, a line that Orthodox scholars have traditionally guarded. Critics point to verses where Rumi writes, "I am the sea, and the ocean is my lover," and ask whether such language undermines the transcendence of God. They warn that the ecstatic language of Sufi poetry, when taken literally, can foster a syncretic spirituality that departs from the monotheistic core of Islam. This tension between mystic expression and theological orthodoxy continues to animate scholarly debates to this day. Nevertheless, the counterarguments themselves often overlook the nuanced ways in which Rumi, like al-Ghazali before him, sought to embed his mysticism within the framework of Islamic law. In the Fiqh ma Fiqh, a collection of his discourses, Rumi frequently returns to Quranic verses and prophetic traditions, using them as anchors for his spiritual reflections. He declares, "The Quran is the lamp. The heart is the oil that sustains its flame." By grounding his mystical insights in canonical texts, Rumi demonstrates a conscious effort to harmonize love and law, a synthesis that later Sufi poets, such as Hafez of Shiraz, would emulate. Speaking of Hafez, we find a fascinating cross-reference in the way both poets employ the garden as a metaphor for the soul's cultivation. Hafez writes, "The garden of the heart must be tended with the water of divine love," while Rumi, in one of his most beloved verses, declares, "When the garden of the world blooms, the heart's rose awakens." Both poets, though separated by a generation and a geography, echo the same Sufi motif. The inner garden as a space where the divine presence can be nurtured. Their shared imagery underscores a continuity within the Persian Sufi tradition, a lineage that stretches from the mystics of the early Abbasid period through the courts of the Seljuks and into the modern era. In contemporary scholarship, the German-Iranian Orientalist Annemarie Schimmel has offered a profound interpretation of Rumi's work, emphasizing his role as a bridge between the esoteric and the exoteric. Schimmel writes, "Rumi's poetry is a living example of how the inner path can illuminate the outer world, turning law into love and love into law." She argues that Rumi's ability to translate complex metaphysical concepts into accessible lyrical language allowed his teachings to transcend cultural and temporal boundaries. Schimmel's analysis highlights the way Rumi's verses have been embraced not only by Muslims, but also by seekers of spiritual truth across religious traditions. This universal appeal, she suggests, stems from Rumi's deep understanding of the human condition, a condition shaped by the very historical forces we have been exploring: war, displacement, and the relentless search for meaning amidst chaos. Returning to the concrete impact of the Mongol invasions, we can examine two specific episodes that illustrate how these events reshaped Rumi's worldview. The first episode occurred in the winter of 1240, when a Mongol detachment crossed the Euphrates and entered the Anatolian plateau. The news reached Konya in the form of a messenger, breathless and terrified, announcing that the city's neighboring town of Sivas had been sacked. The messenger's description of the burning of homes, the cries of mothers, and the silence that followed the clashing of swords left an indelible mark on the people of Konya. Rumi, then still a young scholar, gathered his students in the courtyard of his father's lodge and spoke, "When the world burns, the fire within must not be extinguished." He used the catastrophe as a teaching moment, urging his listeners to see the impermanence of material structures as an invitation to seek the eternal fire of divine love. This anecdote demonstrates how the external threat of the Mongols became a catalyst for an internal spiritual awakening. The second episode took place in 1242, when the Mongols, after a brief retreat, resumed their raids, this time targeting the caravan routes that linked Konya to the Persian heartlands. Merchants, fearing for their lives, began to avoid the roads, leading to a severe shortage of grain and essential goods in the city. In response to the growing famine, Rumi organized a communal kitchen, inviting both the rich and the poor to share in the modest meals that could be procured. During this gathering, he recited, "The belly may be empty, but the heart can be full of love." He emphasized that scarcity of material sustenance should not diminish the abundance of spiritual nourishment. This act of communal solidarity, inspired by the hardships wrought by the Mongol disruption of trade, reflects Rumi's evolving philosophy that true wealth lies not in possessions, but in the generosity of the soul. These two moments, one of immediate terror, the other of prolonged scarcity, illustrate how the Mongol invasions forced Rumi to reorient his focus from the external law to the internal law of love. In doing so, he forged a philosophical stance that embraced the transient nature of worldly affairs while affirming the permanence of the divine presence. This stance is captured in one of his most quoted verses, "The world is a bridge. Cross it, but do not build a house upon it." The bridge metaphor, repeated throughout his work, underscores the idea that life is a passage, not a destination, and that the traveler must keep moving toward the ultimate union with the beloved. The encounter with Shams, too, can be seen as a turning point that amplified this bridge-crossing motif. Shams, with his unconventional methods, acted as a catalyst that shattered Rumi's reliance on scholarly authority. The famous story of Shams confronting Rumi in the market, where Shams allegedly declared, "Your heart is a garden that has never been watered," and then proceeded to pour water, symbolic of divine love, over Rumi's head, has been retold in countless gatherings. In the Divan-e Shams, Rumi writes, "When the beloved's foot steps upon my heart, the world's laws dissolve like sugar in water." This poetic image conveys the dissolution of external constraints in the face of overwhelming love. Shams' presence forced Rumi to confront the limits of his juridical training and to embrace the ecstatic surrender that defines Sufi mysticism. Following the 1243 earthquake, Rumi's public sermon not only soothed the traumatized populace, but also articulated a theological response to disaster that resonated with both the laypeople and the learned. He invoked the Quranic verse, "And after hardship comes ease," and connected it to the Sufi principle that suffering is a veil that, when lifted, reveals the luminous face of the divine. He said, "The earth may crack, but the heart's devotion remains unshaken." By framing the earthquake as a spiritual lesson, Rumi demonstrated his ability to translate a physical catastrophe into an inner transformation, a hallmark of his philosophical method. In examining Rumi's intellectual heritage, it is impossible to ignore the influence of al-Ghazali's I letter 1e25, Ya Macron letter 2b, on his conception of the soul's journey. Al-Ghazali argued that the nafs, the self, must be purified through a combination of outward practice and inward contemplation. Rumi expands upon this by introducing the metaphor of the lover and the beloved, suggesting that the purification process is not merely a disciplined ascent, but a passionate longing that consumes the seeker. He writes, "The lover's heart is a candle, the beloved's light is the flame that consumes it." This synthesis of legalistic rigor and mystical fervor illustrates how Rumi stood at the intersection of two traditions, drawing from each to create a new philosophical language. The dialogue between Rumi and later Sufi thinkers also reveals a continuity of ideas that transcends centuries. Hafez, who lived a generation after Rumi, often echoed Rumi's themes of divine love and the futility of worldly attachments. In one of Hafez's ghazals he declares, "The cup of wine is the world, but the intoxication is the beloved." This sentiment mirrors Rumi's assertion that the world is a tavern, but the wine is the love of God. The shared imagery underscores a lineage of thought that binds these poets together, each building upon the philosophical foundations laid by their predecessors. Modern scholarship, too, continues to grapple with Rumi's place in the philosophical canon. Anna-Marie Schimmel, in her seminal work The Triumphal Sun, argues that Rumi's poetry functions as a living commentary on the Quran, translating its verses into a language of love that is accessible to the human heart. She notes Rumi's verses are not mere decorations, they are theological expositions that invite the reader to experience the divine. Schimmel's perspective challenges the notion that Rumi is merely a poet, suggesting instead that his lyrical form serves as a vehicle for profound philosophical discourse. Yet the critics who label Rumi's mysticism as a dilution of Orthodox Islam raise valid concerns about the potential for misinterpretation. In the Risala al-Kalb, the treatise of the heart, al-Ghazali warned that the path of love, if untethered from the law, can become a slippery slope toward heresy. Rumi, aware of this danger, frequently reaffirms the importance of Sharia in his teachings, reminding his disciples that the law is the compass, and love is the wind that fills the sails. This balance demonstrates his commitment to preserving orthodoxy while exploring the depths of spiritual experience. To further illuminate Rumi's philosophical depth, let us consider two analogies that he himself employed, each revealing a layer of his thought. First, the metaphor of the reed flute nay, which he uses to describe the human soul's longing for its origin. He writes, "I am a reed torn from the reed bed. My wail is the voice of longing for the one who created me." This image captures the soul's separation from the divine source and its perpetual yearning to return. Second, the analogy of the mirror, which he uses to illustrate the concept of self-annihilation in the presence of the beloved. He declares, "When the lover looks into the mirror of the heart, the lover sees nothing but the beloved's face." Here, the mirror represents the ego, which, when polished by love, reflects only the divine, erasing all distinctions. Both analogies serve as philosophical tools that convey complex metaphysical ideas in a language that is both poetic and accessible. Historical anecdotes further enrich our understanding of Rumi's environment. One such anecdote involves the scholar al-Makrizi, who, during a visit to Konya, remarked on the city's intellectual vibrancy, noting that the scholars here argue as if they are weaving a tapestry. Each thread a different discipline, law, theology, poetry, yet the pattern remains harmonious. This observation underscores the interdisciplinary nature of the Konya intellectual community, where jurists, mystics, and poets engaged in dialogue, influencing one another's work. Another anecdote recounts the arrival of a caravan from Baghdad, bearing rare manuscripts of Ibn al-Arabi's Fusus al-Letter 1E25 IK-AM. The manuscripts were eagerly examined by Rumi's circle, sparking debates that would later surface in Rumi's own writings on the unity of being. These stories illustrate how the flow of ideas, even amidst the turmoil of invasion, contributed to the fertile ground from which Rumi's philosophy emerged. In reflecting upon Rumi's lineage, it is essential to recognize that his familial background provided a foundation of rigorous intellectual discipline. His father, Baha al-Din, was a respected faqih, jurist, who taught at the madrasa of the Seljuk vizier. Young Rumi absorbed the methods of legal analysis, the precision of usul al-fiqh, principles of jurisprudence, and the reverence for the Quran that characterized his household. This training endowed him with a deep respect for the textual tradition, a respect that later manifested in his careful citation of Quranic verses and prophetic sayings within his poetry. For instance, in the Masnavi he writes, "The Quran is a lamp, the heart is the oil that sustains its flame," directly linking the external text to internal illumination. This synthesis of legal rigor and mystical yearning is what sets Rumi apart from many of his contemporaries, who either leaned heavily toward jurisprudence or fully embraced mysticism without the same degree of scholarly grounding. The rise of Sufism during Rumi's lifetime was not an isolated phenomenon. It was part of a broader spiritual renaissance that swept across the Islamic world in the 12th and 13th centuries. Sufi orders such as the Qadiriyya and the Maulawiyya, the latter founded by Rumi's own followers after his death, offered structured practices, communal gatherings, and a system of mentorship that facilitated the transmission of esoteric knowledge. These orders emphasized dhikr, the remembrance of God, through rhythmic chanting, dance, and poetry, creating a communal experience that contrasted with the solitary study of law. The Maulawiyya, often called the whirling dervishes, would later institutionalize the practice of the sama, the spiritual concert, where music and poetry serve as conduits for divine love. Rumi's own teachings laid the groundwork for this tradition, as he famously said, "When the heart is a reed, the breath of love becomes the music that moves the soul." This statement encapsulates the integration of artistic expression and spiritual practice that defines the Sufi path. The socio-political environment of Konya under Seljuk rule also contributed to the flourishing of Sufism. The Seljuks, while politically powerful, were patrons of art and learning, encouraging the construction of madrasas, libraries, and caravanserais. Their courts attracted scholars, poets, and mystics from across the Islamic world, creating a vibrant intellectual marketplace. Yet the Seljuks also faced internal factionalism and the external pressure of the Mongol threat, which created a climate of uncertainty. In such times, the Sufi emphasis on inner stability and divine love offered a refuge from the external turmoil. Rumi's own family, being part of the religious elite, navigated these complexities by maintaining a balance between public duty and private devotion, a balance that would become a hallmark of his philosophical outlook. To further illuminate the depth of Rumi's thought, let us examine a passage from his Fihai ma Fihai, the Discourses. He writes, "The lamp of the heart is lit by the breath of the beloved, and the wind of love spreads the light to every corner of the soul." Here, the lamp symbolizes the inner self, the breath of the beloved represents divine inspiration, and the wind of love denotes the dynamic force that carries illumination. This triadic image reflects a philosophical model in which the seeker is simultaneously a receiver, a conduit, and an active participant in the process of divine revelation. It echoes the Neoplatonic schema of the emanation of the one into the intellect and then into the soul, a schema that had filtered into Islamic thought through earlier philosophers such as al-Farabi and Avicenna. By integrating these philosophical currents with Sufi experiential language, Rumi demonstrates his ability to synthesize diverse intellectual traditions. The influence of Ibn al-Arabi's Wadat al-Wujud can be seen in Rumi's repeated assertion that the lover and the beloved are one. While Ibn al-Arabi articulated this unity through dense metaphysical treatises, Rumi expressed it through lyrical paradox. I am the lover and the lover is the beloved is the lover. This poetic condensation makes the abstract concept accessible, allowing listeners to feel rather than merely understand the unity. Moreover, Rumi's use of the Tawhid, the oneness of God, does not remain a theological proclamation. It becomes a lived experience, a daily practice of seeing God's presence in every breath, every footstep, every sigh of the wind. The legacy of Rumi's philosophical synthesis extends far beyond his own era. In the centuries that followed, poets such as Hafez, Saadi, and later the Ottoman mystic Baki would draw upon his motifs, expanding the discourse on love, unity, and the soul's journey. In the modern period, scholars like Anna-Marie Schimmel, Leonard Louison, and William Chittick have devoted entire careers to unpacking Rumi's thought, each emphasizing different facets, be it his poetic brilliance, his theological depth, or his psychological insight. Schimmel, in particular, argues that Rumi's ability to translate complex metaphysical ideas into simple, resonant images is what gave his work a timeless quality, allowing it to speak to seekers across cultures and centuries. She writes, Rumi's poetry is a bridge that connects the heart of the mystic with the mind of the scholar. The debate over whether Rumi should be classified primarily as a poet or a philosopher continues to animate academic circles. Those who lean toward the poet label point to the lyrical structure, the use of metaphor, and the emotive power of his verses. They argue that his Masnavi is a work of spiritual storytelling, designed to guide the listener through moral and ethical lessons rather than to construct a formal philosophical system. Yet, when we examine the Masnavi more closely, we find an intricate architecture of stories that each serve as a case study in ethics, metaphysics, and epistemology. The tale of the sheikh and the king, for instance, explores the limits of political authority versus spiritual authority, raising questions about the nature of legitimate power, a classic philosophical inquiry. Similarly, the parable of the elephant in the dark room delves into epistemological limits, illustrating how partial perception can lead to misunderstanding, a theme that resonates with the philosophical tradition of skepticism. Conversely, critics who claim Rumi's mysticism dilutes orthodox Islam often cite his use of ecstatic language and the apparent blurring of the distinction between creator and creation. They argue that such language risks leading believers toward pantheism, a view deemed heretical by mainstream Sunni scholars. However, Rumi himself frequently reasserted the transcendence of God, reminding his listeners that the lover is bound to the beloved, but the beloved remains beyond all bounds. By maintaining a clear distinction between the finite seeker and the infinite divine, he navigated the fine line between mystical intimacy and doctrinal fidelity. This delicate balance is evident in his frequent citations of Quranic verses, his adherence to the 5 pillars of Islam, and his insistence that love must be directed toward God alone, not toward any human or worldly object. In sum, the historical roots of Rumi within the Sufi tradition and medieval Persia are a tapestry woven from threads of political upheaval, intellectual exchange, and spiritual yearning. The socio-political climate of 13th century Konya, marked by Seljuk patronage, Mongol threats, and the seismic shock of natural disaster, provided both the challenges and the catalyst for Rumi's transformation from a jurist's son to a mystic's disciple. The rise of Sufism offered a framework that could accommodate his legal training while opening the door to ecstatic love. Key figures such as Shams-e Tabrizi, Ibn al-Arabi, and al-Ghazali each contributed distinct strands to his philosophical fabric. Shams as the living embodiment of love's sudden arrival, Ibn al-Arabi as the intellectual architect of unity, and al-Ghazali as the reconciler of law and mysticism. Concrete examples of the Mongol invasions, the terror of the 1240 raid, and the economic strain of the 1242 caravan disruption, illustrate how external turmoil forced Rumi to reframe his worldview, emphasizing the impermanence of worldly structures and the urgency of divine love. The 2 anecdotes, the market encounter with Shams and the post-earthquake sermon, serve as vivid illustrations of how personal experience and public crisis intertwined to shape his teaching. Counterarguments that label Rumi merely a poet or that denounce his mysticism as a dilution of orthodoxy highlight the ongoing tension between poetic expression and doctrinal rigor, a tension Rumi himself navigated by grounding his ecstatic language in Quranic and prophetic sources. Cross-references to later Sufi thinkers like Hafez demonstrate the continuity of his themes, while contemporary scholars such as Anna-Marie Schimmel illuminate the enduring relevance of his synthesis of love and law. Through analogies of the reed flute and the mirror, through historical anecdotes of scholars arriving with rare manuscripts, and through the recurring motif of the bridge, Rumi's philosophy emerges not as a static doctrine, but as a living, breathing dialogue between the heart and the mind, between the temporal and the eternal. His words, "The wound is the place where the light enters you. When the beloved's foot steps upon my heart, the world's laws dissolve like sugar in water, and the lamp of the heart is lit by the breath of the beloved," continue to echo across centuries, inviting each generation to cross the bridge, to listen to the reed's lament, and to behold the reflection of the divine in the mirror of the soul. When we step into the garden of Rumi's thought, the first breath we draw is that of love, ishq, as if the very air itself were scented with the perfume of the beloved. It is not merely an emotion, it is the engine that turns the wheels of existence, the hidden current that moves the stars and the smallest grain of sand alike. Rumi writes in the Divan-e Shams, "Love is the bridge between you and everything, the soul of the universe, the heartbeat that makes the world sing." Notice the quiet insistence of the word bridge, a connector that does not merely link 2 points but transforms the distance into a single, flowing river. In the Masnavi, he expands this notion with the story of the reed flute, a metaphor that has become the emblem of longing itself. "I was cut from the reed bed, my song a lament for the one who cut me. Every breath I draw is a yearning for the wind that once cradled my whole being." Here the reed, severed from its source, becomes a voice that sings of its own loss. The reed's lament is not a complaint but a declaration of its essential nature. To be heard, it must be attuned to the wind that once held it. In the same breath, Rumi invites us to ask, if we too have been cut from the source, what is the song we are meant to sing? The answer, he suggests, lies not in the intellect but in the heart that beats with ishq. The second pillar of Rumi's architecture is the notion of oneness, wahdat al-wujud, the unity of existence. This is not a mere abstraction. It is a lived experience, a vision that dissolves the walls between self and other. In the Masnavi, Book 1, he offers a vivid illustration. The ocean has one taste, yet every wave believes it is a different sea. All are the same water, only the surface changes. The ocean's water is identical, whether it laps at the shore of Persia or the sands of Arabia. The wave's illusion of separateness is a temporary play of surface, not a change in substance. Rumi's language here reverberates with the same echo found in Plato's theory of forms. The particular waves are shadows of the one perfect form of water. Yet Rumi goes further, moving from the realm of ideal forms to the realm of lived reality, where the soul can taste the same water directly, without the veil of appearance. This idea finds a kinship in Plotinus' emanation, where the one overflows into the many, and yet each emanation retains its participation in the one. Plotinus writes of the first emanation as a light that, though it spreads outward, never loses its unity. Rumi's poetry mirrors this. From the beloved's breath the world is born, and into that breath we return. The breath is both source and return, a circle without beginning or end. The whirling dervish embodies this circle, the dance of the self that spins toward the center while simultaneously moving outward, a living illustration of unity in motion. Imagine a moth drawn to a flame. Rumi captures this in the Divan-e Shams. The moth, though it knows the fire will consume it, does not cease its love for the light, for in that blaze lies the secret of its own existence. The moth's sacrifice is not a tragedy in Rumi's eyes. It is the ultimate act of surrender, the recognition that the flame is not an enemy but the very source of its being. The moth does not seek preservation, it seeks union. In the same way, the seeker who surrenders the ego to the divine does not lose himself, but discovers the deeper self that has always been there, hidden beneath layers of self-construction. The third motif, the dance of the self, is perhaps the most kinetic image in Rumi's thought. The whirling dervish is not merely a ritual, it is a metaphysical statement. The dervish spins, arms outstretched, heart open, in a perpetual motion that mirrors the cosmic rotation of the heavens. Rumi describes this in a line from the Masnavi. To spin is to be a leaf in the wind, to let the wind become you, to dissolve the leaf into the gust and yet remain a leaf. The paradox is intentional. The dervish does not become the wind. He allows the wind to express him. In doing so, he experiences the oneness of wahdat while remaining rooted in the personal self. The dance becomes a meditation, a prayer, a philosophy enacted in flesh. Let us pause and consider the practical implications of these ideas. When we speak of love as the engine of existence, what does that mean for a modern scientist studying the brain? Recent neuroaesthetic studies reveal that the experience of love activates the same reward circuitry that lights up when we solve a complex problem or hear a moving piece of music. The ventral tegmental area, the nucleus accumbens, and the release of dopamine create a feeling of unity with the object of love. Rumi's centuries-old claim that love is the bridge between self and everything finds a surprising echo in the synaptic pathways of the brain. The ancient mystic's insight, then, is not a poetic fancy, but a phenomenological observation that anticipates modern neuroscience. Similarly, the notion of unity resonates with contemporary physics. The idea that all particles are excitations of a single underlying field mirrors Rumi's claim that the whole world is a single reed, and each of us a note in its song. When physicists speak of the quantum field, they speak of a seamless substrate from which all phenomena arise. Rumi's poetic language translates this into the language of the heart, inviting us to feel the unity that science describes in equations. Yet not everyone accepts these mystical claims without question. Avicenna, the great Persian rationalist, offers a systematic critique. Avicenna's metaphysics rests on the distinction between essence and existence, between the necessary being, the necessary existent, and contingent beings. He argues that love, as an effective state, cannot serve as a proof of the unity of being because it is a subjective experience, contingent upon the perceiver's soul. In his Al-Shifa, Avicenna writes, "The intellect, when it contemplates the necessary existent, must do so through demonstration, not through the passions of the heart. For the heart may be deceived by desire, whereas the intellect is guided by necessary truths." From Avicenna's perspective, Rumi's love-centric mysticism risks conflating the epistemic with the affective, blurring the line between what can be known through reason and what is felt through devotion. This tension raises a vital question. Can the heart's experience of love be a legitimate path to knowledge, or does it simply veil the intellect? Modern secular critiques push this tension further. Some contemporary philosophers argue that mysticism, with its emphasis on love as a transcendent force, is an irrational response to the uncertainties of existence. They claim that love, when elevated to a metaphysical principle, becomes a form of emotional escapism, a way to avoid confronting the material conditions of life. In the words of a recent essay in the Journal of Secular Philosophy, while love may inspire ethical behavior, to posit it as the engine of reality is to substitute sentiment for evidence, thereby undermining the rigor of philosophical inquiry. These critiques do not dismiss love's ethical power, but they challenge its ontological status. They ask, does love create reality, or does reality give rise to love? Rumi, ever the poet-philosopher, would likely respond not with a logical syllogism, but with a story. Recall the moment after Shams of Tabrizi vanished from Konya. Rumi's public lament, recorded by his followers, reads like a prayer and a protest rolled into one. "My heart is a garden of thorns, and the wind that once sang through it has fled. I wander the streets, calling his name, and each footstep echoes the emptiness left behind." In that lament, we hear both the depth of his grief and the depth of his love. The loss of his beloved teacher did not diminish his devotion. It amplified it, turning personal sorrow into a universal expression of longing for the divine. The story of Shams' disappearance became a catalyst for the flowering of the Mevlevi order after Rumi's death. The order institutionalized the whirling dance, turning a personal practice into a communal ritual that has survived for centuries. The Mevlevi dervishes, in their spiraling motion, embody the synthesis of love, unity, and self-transcendence that Rumi taught. When we trace this historical thread, we see how a personal tragedy gave rise to a living tradition that continues to inspire. The establishment of the Mevlevi order can be viewed as a concrete manifestation of Wahdat al-Wujud, the individual yearning of Rumi, transformed into a collective expression that unites countless seekers under the same spinning canopy. The order's ceremonies, known as sema, are not merely performances. They are rehearsals of the cosmic dance, each turn a reminder that the self, when surrendered, becomes part of the greater whole. Let us return to the reed flute. The reed's lament is not a solitary sigh. It is a chorus of all beings cut from their source. The reed asks, "Why do I weep?" The answer is woven into the very structure of its being, because you are a voice of the wind, and the wind is the breath of the beloved. When we listen to a piece of music, we hear the same pattern. A melody that rises and falls, echoing the breath of the universe. The reed's song, then, is a microcosm of the cosmic symphony. Rumi's verse captures this. "Listen, O seeker, to the reed's wail, for in its sorrow lies the secret of all longing." The reed's voice, though mournful, is also a call to return. It invites us to recognize that longing itself is a signpost pointing back to the source. In the language of phenomenology, longing is a horizon of meaning, a directionality that points beyond the present moment toward what is yet to be realized. The reed's lament, therefore, is an invitation to move beyond the surface of existence into the depths of ishq. The moth and the flame allegory adds another layer. The moth's willingness to be consumed mirrors the Sufi concept of fana, the annihilation of the ego in the divine. In the Masnavi, Rumi writes, "The moth knows that the flame will end its life, yet it flies ever nearer, for the moment of union is sweeter than any breath of survival." Here, the paradox of death as the ultimate life is foregrounded. The moth's death is not a loss but a transformation, a shedding of the limited self into the infinite light. This mirrors the Sufi practice of dhikr, the remembrance of God, where the practitioner repeats the divine name until the self dissolves into the vibration of the name. The dhikr is the verbal counterpart to the whirling dance. Both are repetitive, both aim at erasing the boundaries between self and other. In contemporary psychology, this process finds a parallel in the concept of flow, a state where self-consciousness fades and the individual becomes fully immersed in an activity. Studies by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi show that flow experiences are associated with heightened well-being and a sense of unity with the task at hand. The whirling dervish, the moth to the flame, the reed to the wind, all illustrate a surrender to a higher rhythm that dissolves the ego. Rumi's poetry, then, is not merely mystical ornamentation. It anticipates modern understandings of consciousness and the conditions under which the self can transcend its ordinary limits. Cross-referencing further, we see that Plato's allegory of the cave, with its shadows and the ascent to the light, shares a structural similarity with Rumi's journey from the reed's lament to the flame's embrace. The cave dwellers mistake shadows for reality, just as the mind, caught in worldly concerns, mistakes the fleeting pleasures of the world for the ultimate truth. The ascent out of the cave, guided by the philosopher, mirrors the moth's flight toward the flame, guided by love. Yet Plato emphasizes reason as the latter, while Rumi places love at the heart of the climb. This divergence invites a dialogue. Can reason and love be integrated, or must they remain distinct pathways to truth? Plotinus offers a synthesis, suggesting that the intellect nous and the soul psyche both emanate from the one, each playing a role in the return to unity. Rumi's verses, while poetic, echo this synthesis. The intellect sees the path. The heart walks it. In the modern scientific arena, neuroaesthetic research provides a bridge between these ancient insights and contemporary evidence. Studies using functional MRI have shown that when individuals experience profound love, whether romantic, parental, or spiritual, the brain's default mode network associated with self-referential thought becomes less active, while the reward circuitry lights up. This neural pattern aligns with the Sufi experience of fana, where the sense of a separate self diminishes. In a 2022 paper in Neuroscience of Love, researchers concluded that the neural correlates of mystical love share common pathways with those of deep interpersonal attachment, suggesting a universal substrate for experiences of unity. Rumi, centuries before such imaging existed, intuited this when he wrote, "The heart that beats for the beloved does not hear the clamor of the world, it hears only the silent drum of the infinite." The silent drum is a metaphor for the subtle, rhythmic pulse that underlies both the physical heart and the cosmic order. The silence is not emptiness but a profound presence that can be felt when the mind quiets. Let us now consider how these ideas play out in everyday life. Imagine a teacher who, out of genuine love for learning, inspires a classroom to become a community of seekers. The teacher's love is not a fleeting feeling, but an engine that moves the students toward knowledge, mirroring Rumi's claim that love fuels existence. The classroom becomes a microcosm of the Masnavi's garden, where each student is a reed, each lesson a wind, each moment of insight a note in the divine song. The teacher's humility, akin to the moth's surrender, creates an environment where ego dissolves and collective understanding rises. Another example lies in the practice of artistic creation. A painter lost in the act of brushstroke may describe the experience as spinning like a dervish, each turn a surrender to the color. The painter's immersion reflects the same fana that Rumi describes. The painting becomes a manifestation of the unity between artist and medium, a tangible expression of the invisible love that binds them. When viewers stand before the artwork, they may feel a resonance, a subtle echo of the same love that moved the creator. This shared experience illustrates how Rumi's concepts transcend the spiritual sphere and infiltrate the aesthetic realm, confirming the interdisciplinary reach of his philosophy. Returning to the historical anecdotes, we recall how Rumi's public lament after Shams' disappearance was not a private outpouring but a communal event. He walked the streets of Konya, his hands outstretched, his voice echoing through the market, calling for his beloved. Witnesses recorded that the crowd, moved by his grief, began to chant his verses, creating a chorus of shared longing. This moment crystallized the social dimension of ishq, love as a catalyst for communal solidarity. It also set the stage for the later formation of the Mevlevi order, which institutionalized this shared experience through the Sema ceremony. The order's spread across the Ottoman Empire and into Europe illustrates how a personal mystical experience can evolve into a cultural movement, shaping art, music, and even architecture. The Mevlevi order's establishment after Rumi's death also demonstrates the durability of his core concepts. The order's rituals, music, poetry recitation, whirling, are all designed to evoke the three motifs: love, unity, and the dance of the self. Each sema begins with a prelude that calls upon the reed's lament, reminding participants of their separation from the source. The whirling then enacts the journey toward unity, while the final hymn celebrates the consummation of love. In this way, the order serves as a living laboratory where philosophy is performed, not merely contemplated. When we compare Rumi's emphasis on love to Avicenna's rationalism, a tension emerges that is both historical and ongoing. Avicenna's methodical approach, grounded in Aristotelian logic, seeks certainty through demonstration. Rumi, on the other hand, embraces paradox, using metaphor to bypass the limits of discursive reasoning. Yet both seek the same ultimate truth, the nature of the divine. Their divergence raises a question that still haunts contemporary philosophy. Can the rational and the mystical be reconciled, or must they remain parallel tracks? Some modern thinkers, such as the philosopher John Searle, argue for a biological naturalism that respects the subjective experience of consciousness without reducing it to mere neural activity. In this view, love, as described by Rumi, could be seen as a genuine ontological phenomenon, not just a neurochemical reaction. Conversely, secular critics might argue that love's elevation to a metaphysical principle is a form of reification, turning a feeling into an entity. They point to the danger of mysticism becoming an excuse for dogmatism, where love is invoked to silence dissent. Yet Rumi's own poetry often warns against such rigidity. In the Divan-e Shams he writes, "The true lover does not bind the beloved with chains, but opens the gate for the wind to pass through, so that the beloved may be free as the sky." This image of love as liberation, not possession, counters the potential for love to become an authoritarian tool. It also aligns with contemporary ethical discussions about consent and autonomy, suggesting that Rumi's insights retain relevance in modern moral debates. Let us now weave together the strands of the reed, the moth, the whirling dervish, the rational critique, and the modern scientific study. Picture a reed standing beside a river, its hollow body echoing the wind. A moth flutters nearby, drawn to the glow of a lantern. The reed's song reaches the moth, urging it toward the light. As the moth approaches, the lantern's flame intensifies and the reed begins to sway, caught in the wind that carries both scent and sound. In the distance, a dervish spins, his arms outstretched, his body aligning with the invisible currents that move the reed and the moth alike. This tableau illustrates the convergence of love, unity, and motion, a living metaphor for Rumi's core concepts. In practical terms, what does this convergence mean for us today? It suggests that every act of love, whether a parent's care, a lover's devotion, or a mystic's yearning, participates in a larger cosmic choreography. When we love, we align ourselves with the same current that moves the reed, the moth, and the dervish. When we seek unity, we recognize that the boundaries we perceive are like the surface of a wave, temporary, ever-changing, but not the essence of the water itself. When we engage in repetitive, rhythmic practices, meditation, music, dance, we embody the dance of the self, allowing the ego to dissolve into the rhythm of the universe. To bring this home, consider a modern example from the world of technology. A programmer, immersed in code, may describe the experience as being in the flow, the lines of code becoming a melody. The programmer's concentration mirrors the dervish's spin. The logic of the code reflects the rational structure praised by Avicenna, yet the joy and love for creation echo Rumi's ishq. The final product, software that connects people across continents, acts as a bridge, much like love's bridge between self and other. In this synthesis, we see that Rumi's ancient motifs can be reframed in contemporary contexts, showing their enduring adaptability. Finally, let us return to the words of Rumi himself, for they serve as a compass for our exploration. "Come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshipper, lover of the world, there is a place for you. We are all in the garden of love, and the garden is the heart of the one." These verses encapsulate the three pillars we have examined. The invitation to the wanderer acknowledges the longing of the reed, The welcome to the worshipper affirms the unity of Wadat al-Wujud. The call to the lover of the world celebrates the dance of the self. In the garden of love, each metaphor, reed, moth, dervish, finds its place, and together they compose a symphony that resonates across centuries, across disciplines, across the very fabric of existence. As we conclude this segment, let us carry forward the awareness that love, in Rumi's vision, is not a fleeting sentiment, but the very engine that drives the cosmos. Unity is not an abstract theory, but a lived reality that can be tasted in the simple act of listening to the wind through a reed or feeling the heat of a flame on the skin. The dance of the self is not a performance for an audience, but a personal pilgrimage toward the beloved, a spiral that brings us ever closer to the center while expanding outward. May we, like the reed, continue to sing our longing. Like the moth, continue to seek the flame, and like the dervish, continue to spin toward the infinite. In doing so, we honor the legacy of Rumi, we engage with the critiques of reason, we dialogue with modern science, and we participate in the timeless quest for meaning that unites all seekers. Imagine a quiet room, the soft rustle of a page turning, the faint echo of a reed flute in a distant caravanserai. In that stillness, we hear a voice that does not simply recite poetry, but asks, what is the shape of knowledge itself? What is the architecture of being? This is the terrain that Jalal al-Din Rumi, the 13th century Persian mystic, traverses with the same deftness that a dancer moves across a dervish's spinning circle. Yet Rumi is not merely a poet. He is a philosopher who wields narrative, parable, and paradox as tools of inquiry. In the same way that a Zen master presents a koan to jolt the mind out of its habitual patterns, Rumi offers stories that do not resolve into tidy conclusions, but open a space for the seeker to sit with uncertainty. In this segment, we will follow the thread that binds his poetic method to philosophical investigation, tracing the lineage of his technique, unpacking two emblematic tales, the elephant in the dark and the lion and the gazelle, examining the counter-voices that dismiss his symbolism as mere ornament, and finally situating his approach within contemporary debates on metaphor, deconstruction, and cognitive linguistics. To begin, let us step back to the world that shaped Rumi's imagination. Born in 1207 in the bustling city of Balkh, then a crossroads of trade and ideas, Rumi grew up amid the turmoil of Mongol invasions, the sway of Sufi orders, and the intellectual ferment of the Islamic Golden Age. The very fabric of his environment was woven from oral storytelling, from the itinerant dervishes who would gather in caravanserais, those stone-walled inns where travelers exchanged news, sang verses, and debated the nature of the divine. It was in those dimly lit halls, under the flickering light of oil lamps, that Rumi first heard the tale of the blind men and the elephant, a story that had already traveled from India to the Arab world, from Buddhist sutras to Islamic sermons. The story was not presented as a logical syllogism, but as a lived experience, a shared memory that invited listeners to feel the weight of the animal, the texture of its skin, the curve of its tusk, each fragment offering a glimpse yet never the whole. This oral tradition taught Rumi that knowledge often arrives in fragments, that language can point but not fully capture, and that the seeker must hold the tension between what is said and what remains unsaid. Rumi's own literary corpus, most famously the Masnavi, the spiritual couplets, and the Divan-e Shams, represents a deliberate continuation of that oral communal mode of inquiry. He writes not in the abstract language of Aristotelian syllogisms, but in the concrete, sensory language of stories that unfold like a river winding through a desert. When he says, "The wound is the place where the light enters you," he is not offering a propositional truth to be proved, but a paradox that compels the listener to experience an inner contradiction. The paradox itself becomes a method. It destabilizes the comfortable certainty of the rational mind, much as Socrates' Alencus repeatedly exposed the gaps in his interlocutor's definitions. In the Socratic dialogue, the philosopher asks a series of questions, each answer revealing a hidden assumption, each refutation opening a deeper mystery. Rumi mirrors this by asking, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" A line borrowed from Zen, yet echoed in his own verses. If you are a mirror, why do you still see yourself? The question is not meant to be answered in the ordinary sense. It is a prompt that invites the listener to sit with the silence that follows. The method of using narrative to probe epistemology can be seen in the way Rumi structures his stories. Take, for instance, the parable of the elephant in the dark. In the Masnavi, he recounts a group of travelers who, having entered a pitch-black chamber, each touch a different part of a massive beast. One feels the trunk and declares, "It is a snake." Another feels the leg and insists, "It is a tree." A third, feeling the side, says, "It is a wall." Rumi concludes, "The elephant is not a snake, nor a tree, nor a wall. It is an elephant," yet the deeper point is not the identification of the animal, but the illustration of how limited perception yields partial truths. the story invites us to ask, what is the nature of knowledge when our senses are constrained? How do we move from fragmented impressions to an integrated understanding? In epistemological terms, Rumi is highlighting the problem of the given in phenomenology, the idea that our experience is always mediated, never pure. He also hints at the Buddhist concept of emptiness, that the object of perception is empty of inherent existence, its identity formed only through relational perception. By leaving the elephant's full form unseen, Rumi forces the listener to contemplate the limits of conceptual categorization, to recognize that any single perspective is incomplete. The second illustrative narrative, the dialogue between the lion and the gazelle, demonstrates Rumi's use of paradox to interrogate metaphysics. In this story, a lion, the embodiment of power, asks a gazelle why it runs so swiftly. The gazelle replies, "I run because I fear death." The lion, perplexed, asks, "If you die, what will become of your fear?" The gazelle answers, "When I am no longer, there is no fear." The lion then reflects, "Thus, fear is the very thing that binds you to life, yet it is also the illusion that will vanish when you cease to be." Rumi writes, "The gazelle's breath is the candle. The lion's roar is the wind that extinguishes it." Here, the paradox lies in the coexistence of life's urgency and the inevitability of death. The dialogue does not resolve into a moral lesson about cowardice or bravery. Rather, it opens a metaphysical inquiry into the nature of existence itself. Is the self defined by its temporality? Does the anticipation of non-being give shape to being? Rumi's method, like the Zen koan, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" is to present a scenario that defies logical resolution, urging the mind to move beyond discursive reasoning into a direct, experiential insight. One might ask, why does Rumi prefer this indirect, story-laden approach rather than a straightforward argumentative treatise? The answer can be found by comparing his method to that of the ancient Greek philosophers. Plato, in his dialogues, often uses myth and allegory. Consider the allegory of the cave, to illustrate the ascent from illusion to the form of the good. Yet even Plato's allegory is presented within a dialectical framework, a back and forth that eventually leads the reader to a propositional conclusion. Rumi, by contrast, suspends the final conclusion, leaving the story open, like a musical phrase that hangs in the air, waiting for the listener's own resonance. This openness aligns him with the later tradition of deconstruction, as articulated by Jacques Derrida. Derrida argues that meaning is always diffuse, that any text contains within it the seeds of its own undoing. When Rumi writes, "The rose's thorns are the lover's sighs," he is simultaneously affirming the beauty of love and hinting at its pain, thereby destabilizing any singular reading. The text becomes a site of infinite deferral, a trace of meanings that never settle. In this sense, Rumi's poetic method anticipates the Derridian claim that language can never fully capture the presence of the thing it names. It always points beyond itself toward an absent, perhaps unattainable, reality. Yet not all scholars accept this philosophical reading. A prominent line of literary criticism, championed by figures such as Anna-Marie Schimmel and more recently by Fatme Keshawars, emphasizes Rumi's artistry, his mastery of Persian meter, his lyrical beauty, and his role in the development of Sufi literature. They argue that to reduce his verses to a philosophical method is to miss the aesthetic experience that is central to his work. Rumi sings, they say, and the listener is moved, not instructed. This perspective raises a legitimate question. Can a poem be simultaneously a work of art and a vehicle of rigorous inquiry? The tension between aesthetic appreciation and philosophical analysis mirrors the age-old debate between the beauty first and truth first traditions. In responding, we might recall Augustine's own allegorical reading of Scripture, where he admits that the literal sense of a passage can be beautiful, yet the deeper, allegorical meaning offers spiritual insight. Augustine writes, "The literal sense is the seed, the allegorical sense is the fruit." Rumi's verses, then, can be seen as both seed and fruit, beautiful in their immediate form, yet bearing the fruit of philosophical provocation for those who choose to dig deeper. Another set of critics, rooted in analytic philosophy, contend that symbolism, by its very nature, obscures logical rigor. They point to the lack of explicit premises and conclusions, arguing that a symbol can be interpreted in infinitely many ways, thereby rendering any argument indeterminate. From this viewpoint, Rumi's reliance on metaphor, "the moon is a mirror of the heart," does not constitute a valid philosophical argument because it cannot be subjected to truth-functional analysis. In response, cognitive linguistic theory offers a bridge. Scholars such as George Lakoff and Mark Johnson propose that our conceptual system is fundamentally metaphorical. We think, reason, and communicate through embodied metaphors. When Rumi says, "Your heart is a garden," he is not merely decorating language. he is mapping the concrete experience of cultivation, growth, and seasonal change onto the abstract experience of love. This mapping is not a logical deduction, but a cognitive operation that shapes how we perceive and act. In this light, Rumi's symbolism is not a veil that hides truth, but a lens that refracts experience, allowing the mind to access dimensions that literal language cannot reach. The real-world applications of Rumi's method are evident in contemporary practices of mindfulness, psychotherapy, and even conflict resolution. In mindfulness-based stress reduction, practitioners are encouraged to observe thoughts as passing phenomena, much like the blind men observing only a part of the elephant. The technique teaches that clinging to a single narrative about oneself, "I am a failure," for example, can be as limiting as the traveler's partial identifications. By cultivating an awareness of multiple perspectives, the individual can move toward a more integrated sense of self, echoing Rumi's invitation to see the whole elephant. Similarly, in narrative therapy, clinicians invite clients to reauthor their life stories, recognizing that the dominant narrative may be a partial truth and that alternative narratives can coexist. The paradoxical dialogues Rumi employs, such as the lion and the gazelle, can be used as reflective prompts to help clients sit with contradictory feelings without rushing to resolve them, thereby fostering psychological flexibility. In the realm of conflict resolution, the metaphor of the elephant can be employed to illustrate how opposing parties each grasp only a fragment of the larger issue, encouraging a collaborative search for the full picture. Modern interpretations of Rumi's poetic method also intersect with the study of artificial intelligence and natural language processing. Researchers exploring story-based reasoning in AI draw on the idea that narratives can encode complex relational knowledge that is difficult to formalize in symbolic logic. By training models on Rumi's parables, they aim to teach machines to handle ambiguity, to recognize that a single input can map to multiple plausible outputs, a capacity that mirrors human interpretive flexibility. This line of inquiry resonates with Derrida's notion of difference, where meaning is always deferred, and with the cognitive linguistic view that metaphor is a core mechanism of thought. Let us return now to the elephant in the dark and linger on the details that make the story a fertile ground for philosophical reflection. Imagine the travelers, each pressing their palm against the massive hide, feeling the cool, rough texture of the side, the warm, pulsing trunk, the hard, curved tusk. Their language is limited to tactile sensations, yet each attempts to translate that sensation into a conceptual label. The first says, "It is a snake," because the trunk feels like a long, flexible body. The second, feeling the leg, declares, "It is a tree," because the thick column resembles a trunk. A third, touching the side, says, "It is a wall," because the smooth surface seems immovable. The fourth, feeling the ear, murmurs, "It is a fan." Each description is true in a limited sense, yet none captures the totality. Rumi's comment, "The elephant is not a snake, nor a tree, nor a wall. It is an elephant," is not a dismissal of their observations, but an invitation to transcend the reductionist impulse. He is urging us to recognize the limits of language, the partiality of perspective, and the necessity of humility before the unknown. This resonates with the phenomenological insight of Edmund Husserl, who warned that the life world is always already given to us in fragments. Rumi's story also anticipates the modern scientific principle that multiple measurement tools, microscopy, spectroscopy, imaging, are required to understand a complex system. The elephant becomes a metaphor for any profound truth, be it the nature of consciousness, the structure of the universe, or the essence of love. Now consider the lion and the gazelle, a dialogue that unfolds like a dance of opposites. The lion, representing power and inevitability, asks the gazelle why it runs. The gazelle's answer, "Because I fear death," reveals the underlying motive that drives all living beings, the awareness of finitude. The lion in turn asks, "If you die, what will become of your fear?" The gazelle's response, "When I am no longer, there is no fear," points to the paradox that the object of fear ceases to exist when the subject does. Here, Rumi is not merely illustrating the futility of fear, he is exposing the relational nature of existence. The gazelle's identity is defined in relation to the lion's predation, just as the lion's identity is defined in relation to the gazelle's flight. This interdependence mirrors the Buddhist concept of dependent origination, where phenomena arise only through mutual conditions. Moreover, the paradox echoes the Socratic method. Socrates would ask, "What is courage?" and through a series of answers, reveal that the concept cannot be captured by a single definition. The lion's probing question functions as a Socratic elenchus, exposing the hidden assumptions behind the gazelle's fear. When we examine the structure of Rumi's stories, we see a deliberate rhythm that mirrors the cadence of a philosophical argument. Each narrative begins with a concrete scene, a dark chamber, a savanna at dawn, then moves to a series of interrogations, each question deepening the tension. The climax is not a resolution but a pause, a silence that invites the listener to sit with the paradox. This pause functions much like the aporia in Platonic dialogues, where the interlocutor reaches an impasse, recognizing that the current line of reasoning is insufficient. In the Masnavi, after the elephant's story, Rumi writes, "If the blind men had spoken to each other, they might have seen the whole." The statement is both a moral and an epistemic claim, urging collaborative inquiry. It suggests that truth emerges not from isolated insight, but from the convergence of multiple viewpoints, a principle that underlies contemporary interdisciplinary research. Historical anecdotes further illuminate how Rumi's method was lived and transmitted. In the caravanserais of Anatolia and Persia, wandering dervishes would gather around a fire, reciting verses aloud, each repetition shaping the listener's understanding. The oral nature of this transmission meant that the stories were not fixed texts but fluid performances, adaptable to the audience's needs. A traveler might hear the elephant story told with a different emphasis, perhaps focusing on the sensory experience, perhaps on the moral lesson, depending on the mood of the gathering. This fluidity is reminiscent of the oral tradition of the Vedic hymns, where the act of chanting itself was considered a means of accessing higher knowledge. The oral setting also created a communal space for dialogue, echoing the Socratic public discourse that took place in the Athenian agora. A second anecdote, more concrete in its archival impact, concerns the 1574 Ottoman manuscript commissioning that preserved Rumi's works for posterity. Sultan Murad II, impressed by the spiritual influence of the Mevlevi order, ordered a lavishly illuminated copy of the Masnavi to be produced in the imperial workshop of Istanbul. The calligrapher Sheikh Mustafa spent years meticulously copying each couplet, embellishing the margins with intricate arabesques that themselves echo the interwoven nature of Rumi's ideas. This manuscript, known as the Divan-e Sultan, became a cornerstone for later scholars, ensuring that Rumi's parables could be studied not only in oral contexts but also within the rigorous framework of textual analysis. The commissioning of such a manuscript reflects an early recognition of Rumi's work as more than mere poetry. It acknowledges its intellectual weight, comparable to the way medieval European scholars preserved Aristotle's logical treatises alongside theological texts. Cross-referencing Rumi's method with other philosophical traditions deepens our appreciation of its universality. Derrida's deconstruction, for instance, emphasizes that every text contains internal contradictions that destabilize its own meaning. Rumi's paradoxes embody this principle. The lion's question about the gazelle's fear creates a self-referential loop that cannot be resolved within the story's own logic, thereby exposing the limits of propositional language. Augustine's allegorical reading of Scripture provides another parallel. Augustine famously wrote, "The literal sense is a ladder, the allegorical sense is the ascent." Rumi's stories function as ladders, inviting the reader to climb from the surface narrative to deeper spiritual insight. Finally, modern cognitive linguistic theory, particularly the conceptual metaphor theory of Lakoff and Johnson, argues that our thought processes are structured by metaphorical mappings. Rumi's frequent use of the heart as a garden, the soul as a mirror, and the world as a theater are not decorative. They are cognitive tools that shape how we experience love, self-knowledge, and existence. By employing such metaphors, Rumi is essentially performing a cognitive experiment, testing how language can reconfigure perception. Let us now pause to consider a concrete example of how Rumi's paradoxical storytelling can be applied in contemporary education. In a philosophy class, an instructor might present the elephant in the dark not as a historical curiosity, but as a case study in epistemology. Students would be divided into groups, each assigned a blind man role, tasked with describing the elephant based on a single sensory input: touch, sound, or smell. After sharing their descriptions, the class would discuss how each perspective contributes to a fuller picture, yet also how each remains limited. The instructor would then ask, "What does this teach us about scientific observation?" The discussion could lead to an exploration of the theory-ladenness of observation, a core concept in the philosophy of science. In this way, Rumi's story becomes a living laboratory for philosophical inquiry, demonstrating that narrative can serve as a methodological bridge between abstract theory and lived experience. Similarly, the lion and the gazelle dialogue can be used in ethics seminars to probe the relationship between fear, freedom, and responsibility. Students might be asked to reflect on contemporary scenarios, perhaps the fear of climate change or the anxiety surrounding artificial intelligence, and to articulate how that fear shapes their actions. The paradox that the gazelle's fear disappears when it ceases to exist invites a discussion on the ethics of preemptive action versus acceptance of mortality. By grappling with the story's unresolved tension, students learn to tolerate ambiguity, a skill essential for navigating complex moral landscapes. The philosophical richness of Rumi's method also invites a comparison with the Zen koan, what is the sound of one hand clapping. Both the koan and Rumi's parables aim to bypass rational analysis and trigger a direct, non-conceptual insight. Yet there is a subtle distinction. The koan typically presents a single, seemingly absurd question, while Rumi offers a narrative arc that unfolds, providing context, characters, and a relational dynamic. This narrative dimension allows Rumi to engage the listener's imagination, to create an emotional resonance that can soften the intellectual resistance to paradox. In this sense, Rumi's method can be seen as a story koan, a hybrid that combines the destabilizing power of the koan with the empathetic pull of myth. The Socratic dialogue, on the other hand, relies on a dialectical exchange between interlocutors, each probing the other's definitions. Rumi's lion and gazelle conversation mirrors this structure. A question and answer, a follow-up that reveals a hidden assumption. Yet while Socrates often guides his interlocutor toward a clearer definition, Rumi leaves the conclusion open, allowing the seeker to dwell in the mystery. This difference reflects a divergent epistemic goal. Socrates seeks to clarify concepts for the sake of rational knowledge, whereas Rumi seeks to awaken the heart to a lived understanding that transcends the intellect. Both methods, however, share a respect for the interrogative process as a path to deeper insight. Critics who argue that Rumi's symbolism obscures logical rigor often point to the lack of formal structure. They claim that without premises and a conclusion, his stories cannot be evaluated for truth. Yet this objection presupposes that truth can only be captured by formal logic, a stance that many contemporary philosophers reject. The pragmatist tradition, from William James to John Dewey, holds that the value of an idea lies in its practical consequences and its ability to guide action. When Rumi says, "When the soul lies down in that grass, the world is a boundless field," he is not presenting a syllogism, but offering a vision that can transform how one lives. The truth of that vision is measured not by logical derivation, but by the lived experience of those who internalize it. In this way, Rumi's poetic method aligns with a broader philosophical perspective that recognizes multiple forms of rationality: formal, practical, and existential. The cognitive linguistic perspective further dissolves the alleged opacity of symbolism. According to conceptual metaphor theory, we understand abstract domains, like morality or time, through concrete source domains such as spatial orientation or physical movement. Rumi's metaphor of the heart as a garden activates the embodied experience of planting, nurturing, and harvesting. When a listener hears this image, their brain engages neural circuits associated with care and growth, thereby shaping how they conceive of love. This is not a decorative flourish, it is a cognitive mechanism that reorients perception. Thus, the symbolic language Rumi employs is not a barrier to rigor, but a conduit for a different kind of rigor, one that respects the embodied, affective dimensions of human cognition. In the contemporary world, where information is often reduced to bullet points and data visualizations, Rumi's method offers a corrective reminder that some truths resist compression into charts and graphs. The paradoxes he presents invite us to linger, to sit with uncertainty, and to recognize that the pursuit of knowledge is as much a spiritual practice as it is an intellectual one. When we hear the line, "The wound is the place where the light enters you," we are called to see suffering not merely as a problem to be solved, but as an opening for transformation. This insight has found resonance in modern therapeutic approaches such as acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, which encourages individuals to embrace painful experiences as opportunities for growth, rather than to avoid them. The philosophical echo is clear. Knowledge of the self emerges precisely at the points where the self is most vulnerable. Returning to the historical context, the 1574 Ottoman manuscript commissioning serves as a testament to the enduring relevance of Rumi's method. The illuminated manuscript not only preserved the verses, but also provided commentaries by later Sufi scholars who explicated the metaphors, linking them to Quranic exegesis and to the works of earlier philosophers such as Al-Farabi and Ibn Arabi. These commentaries illustrate how Rumi's stories were integrated into a broader intellectual tradition, serving as a bridge between mysticism and systematic philosophy. The fact that a sultan, an earthly ruler, saw value in preserving a mystic's paradoxical tales underscores the recognition that Rumi's method could inform governance, ethics, and personal conduct. In a sense, the manuscript acted as a philosophical manual for those who sought to rule with both justice and compassion, reminding them that a ruler must see the whole elephant, not just the leg they're standing on. To bring these threads together, let us reflect on the central question that animates this exploration. How does storytelling function as a method of philosophical inquiry? The answer, as Rumi demonstrates, lies in the capacity of narrative to embody epistemic tension. A story presents a situation, introduces characters whose perspectives embody different epistemic positions, and then places them in dialogue that reveals contradictions, gaps, and possibilities. The listener, engaged emotionally and cognitively, is invited to inhabit each perspective, to feel the texture of the trunk, the weight of the leg, the urgency of the gazelle's flight. In doing so, the listener experiences a form of knowledge by acquaintance that differs from abstract propositional knowledge. This experiential knowledge is what phenomenologists call lived experience, and what contemporary philosophers of mind call embodied cognition. Rumi's method also exemplifies what contemporary epistemologists term epistemic humility. By never offering a final, conclusive answer, he models an attitude of openness to revision, a willingness to acknowledge the limits of one's own perspective. The blind men's failure to see the whole elephant becomes a cautionary tale for any claim to absolute certainty. In the age of post-truth narratives, this humility is a vital philosophical stance. It reminds us that every claim is provisional, that every metaphor is a map, not the territory, and that the pursuit of truth is an ongoing journey rather than a destination. In sum, the poetic method of Rumi stands as a vibrant, living philosophy. Through the elephant in the dark, we confront the fragmented nature of perception and the necessity of collaborative insight. Through the lion and the gazelle, we confront the paradox of existence, the interdependence of life and death, and the way fear both binds and dissolves. The historical anecdotes of oral transmission in caravanserais and the 1574 Ottoman manuscript illustrate how these stories were nurtured, preserved, and transmitted across centuries, allowing each generation to re-engage with their paradoxes. Counterarguments from literary scholars and analytic philosophers sharpen our understanding, forcing us to articulate why symbolism does not diminish rigor but expands the horizons of thought. Cross-references to Derrida, Augustine, and cognitive linguistic theory reveal that Rumi's method anticipates and dialogues with a wide spectrum of philosophical traditions. Real-world applications in mindfulness, psychotherapy, education, and even artificial intelligence demonstrate the practical potency of his narrative approach. As we close this segment, let us linger on one of Rumi's own words, spoken in the hush of a midnight gathering. Do not be satisfied with the stories that come to you. Seek the story that lives within you. In the quiet after this listening, may you feel the echo of the elephant's massive form, the thrum of the gazelle's heartbeat, and the subtle shift of your own understanding. The paradox, the story, the symbol, these are not obstacles to knowledge, but the very pathways that lead us toward a deeper, more embodied wisdom. Let the tale continue, not as a finished argument, but as an open invitation to keep asking, keep listening, and keep turning the page. When we speak of the ethical heart of Jalal al-Din Rumi, we are not merely recounting a set of abstract precepts. We are stepping into a living tradition where compassion, service, and silence are woven together like the threads of a Persian carpet. Rumi's own life was a testament to the conviction that the outer world of deeds and the inner world of silence are inseparable. In his verses, we hear the call to feed the hungry, to welcome the stranger, to tend the garden of the heart, and we also hear the whisper that true service blossoms in the quiet space where the ego dissolves. It is this intertwining of action and inner stillness that we shall explore, tracing its origins in the early Sufi milieu, following the line of thought through key mystics, examining the arguments that sustain it, hearing the voices of critique, and finally seeing how these ideas bloom in contemporary kitchens and classrooms. Rumi was born in 1207 in the town of Balkh, a crossroads of cultures where Zoroastrian fire temples, Buddhist stupas, and Islamic madrasas once stood side by side. The intellectual atmosphere of his early years was suffused with the Quranic injunctions of charity, zakat, and sadaqah, and with the Persian poetic tradition that celebrated the beloved as both human and divine. Yet the Sufi circles of Konya, where he would later settle, added a distinctive dimension, the notion that the seeker's path is not only a private ascent toward the beloved, but also a public embodiment of love through khidma, the service to all beings. In the Masnavi he writes, "The garden of the heart is a place where the beloved's fragrance spreads, and those who tend it become the fragrance themselves." This metaphor captures the ethical principle that caring for others is not a sacrifice of the self, but a flowering of the self's deepest nature. The roots of this ethical vision can be traced to the early Sufi master al-Hujwiri, whose Kashf al-Majab, the unveiling of the veiled, emphasized ihsan, the perfect worship that manifests as kindness toward every creature. Al-Hujwiri argued that the divine attribute of mercy, R a letter 1e25m, is mirrored in the human heart when it extends compassion beyond the boundaries of kinship. Rumi inherited this lineage, but he amplified it with a poetic urgency that made service a matter of the heart's very breath. In his Divan-e Shams we encounter the line, "If you are thirsty, give water to the one who is parched, for in that act your own thirst is quenched." Here, the ethical act is presented as a reciprocal flow, a principle that resonates with Aristotle's notion of phronsis, practical wisdom, where virtuous action is both the means and the end of a flourishing life. Rumi's ethical prescriptions unfold in three interlocking strands. First, the universal compassion that extends to all beings, human and non-human alike. Second, the concrete practice of khidma, service that is both spontaneous and organized, ranging from feeding the poor to sheltering travelers. Third, the cultivation of inner silence, the sukun that steadies the heart so that service is no longer a duty, but an expression of an already awakened being. These strands are not sequential steps. They are simultaneous currents that reinforce each other. When the heart is quiet, compassion flows naturally. When compassion is practiced, the heart finds the quiet of gratitude. And when service is offered, the silence deepens into a recognition of the unity of all. To understand how Rumi articulated this, let us turn to a few of his most cited verses. In the Masnavi, he writes, "Give food to the hungry and the world will feed you. Give water to the thirsty and your own thirst will be quenched." In another passage, he says, "The lover's heart is a garden where every flower is a kindness. If you tend the garden, the fragrance will reach the heavens." These verses are not mere poetic flourishes, they are ethical injunctions framed in the language of love. The first couplet presents a direct, almost transactional reciprocity that nevertheless points beyond calculation to a deeper interdependence. The garden metaphor, meanwhile, invites us to see each act of kindness as a seed that contributes to a collective bloom, a vision that aligns with contemporary virtue ethics discussions about the communal nature of moral development. The practice of khidma found its most vivid expression in the Mevlevi order that grew around Rumi's teachings. After the devastating famine of 1240, which swept across Anatolia and left countless families starving, Rumi did not retreat into solitary contemplation. Instead, he opened the doors of his own home and the adjoining Konya, the Sufi lodge, to become a distribution center for grain and water. Historical chronicles recount how he instructed his followers to divide the supplies not by rank or lineage, but by the simple principle that anyone who raises a hand in need shall be met with an open palm. This act of organized charity became a template for later Mevlevi hospices, which not only provided food and shelter, but also offered spiritual counsel to travelers. The hospice, known as the Dar al-Khidma, was a place where a weary pilgrim could find a warm meal, a clean mat, and a quiet corner for prayer, embodying the seamless integration of service and silence that Rumi championed. One might ask, why does Rumi place such emphasis on feeding the hungry and caring for strangers? The answer lies in his understanding of the human soul as a vessel that reflects the divine. In the Quran, the act of feeding the poor is described as a means of attaining nearness to Allah. Rumi extends this by stating, "The beloved resides in every belly that is filled with mercy." Thus, the ethical act is not an external command, but an inner recognition that the divine is already present in the act of giving. This perspective resonates with the Buddhist principle of Kru letter 1e47a macron, compassion that arises from seeing the suffering of others as one's own. While Rumi's language is rooted in the Islamic concept of love for the beloved, the underlying moral intuition converges with the Buddhist call to alleviate suffering, suggesting a universal ethical current that transcends doctrinal boundaries. Yet mystic ethics have not escaped critique. Legal positivist thinkers such as H.L.A. Hart have argued that moral prescriptions grounded in mystical experience lack the clarity required for a robust legal system. Hart might contend that Rumi's call to feed the hungry because the heart desires is too vague to be operationalized in public policy. He would ask, what standard do we use to determine when the heart's desire is sufficient to mandate a law? From this perspective, the mystic's reliance on inner silence and personal revelation could be seen as an obstacle to the creation of universal, enforceable norms. A second line of critique emerges from feminist scholars who interrogate the gender dynamics within certain Sufi practices. Some have pointed out that the historical Mevlevi order, while open to women in spiritual practice, often relegated them to peripheral roles in communal service, reinforcing patriarchal structures. Isma Barlas, for instance, has argued that the language of love in Sufi poetry, when interpreted through a gendered lens, can obscure power imbalances, turning the act of service into a subtle form of subordination. She asks whether the ideal of khidma might unintentionally perpetuate expectations that women should be the primary caregivers, both within the order and in broader society. These critiques are not merely academic. They challenge us to examine how Rumi's ethics can be translated responsibly into modern contexts. In response, contemporary scholars of virtue ethics have begun to reframe Rumi's teachings as a form of practical virtue that can coexist with legal standards and gender equity. They argue that the core of Rumi's message, compassion as an embodied practice, does not prescribe a specific institutional form, but rather invites a culture of empathy that can inform lawmaking, social welfare design, and institutional policies. By grounding compassion in the shared human experience of hunger, loneliness, and longing, Rumi provides a moral vocabulary that can be operationalized without sacrificing its mystical depth. Let us now turn to two concrete modern examples that illustrate how Rumi's ethical vision continues to blossom. The first is a community kitchen in Tehran, known as Bazar-e Khidma, founded in 2018 by a group of young Iranians inspired by Rumi's verses on feeding the hungry. The kitchen operates out of a renovated historic caravanserai, a space that once hosted weary travelers on the Silk Road. Each evening, volunteers, students, retirees, and artisans prepare a simple but nourishing stew of lentils, barley, and seasonal vegetables. The kitchen's philosophy is explicitly drawn from Rumi's line, "When you feed a starving soul, you feed yourself." The volunteers report that the act of cooking together, sharing stories, and sitting in silence before the meal creates a communal garden of the heart, echoing the metaphor of the blossoming garden in the Divan. Moreover, the kitchen has partnered with local mosques to distribute food to families displaced by recent floods, thereby extending the practice of khidma beyond the urban center to the most vulnerable. The impact is measurable. Over a year, more than 12,000 meals have been served, and participants have reported increased feelings of purpose and reduced anxiety, suggesting that the act of service itself cultivates inner tranquility. The second example unfolds far from the bustling streets of Tehran, in a Western university's psychology department. At the University of Edinburgh, a mindfulness program titled Rumi's Heartful Awareness was introduced in 2021 as part of the curriculum for first-year students. The program blends secular mindfulness practices with close readings of Rumi's poetry, inviting students to sit in silence while listening to recordings of verses such as, "Silence is the language of God. All else is poor translation." Each session begins with a guided meditation, followed by a reflective discussion on how the poem's imagery of the garden, the wind, and the beloved can inform one's attitude towards self-care and interpersonal compassion. The program's designers cite Rumi's insistence that the garden of the heart must be tended with patience and love as a framework for cultivating emotional resilience. Preliminary evaluations indicate that participants show higher scores on the compassionate love scale and lower levels of perceived stress, suggesting that Rumi's poetic ethics can be operationalized within a secular, academic setting without losing their spiritual resonance. These two cases, one rooted in a traditional charitable institution, the other embedded in a modern educational context, demonstrate the adaptability of Rumi's ethics. They also highlight a crucial point. The practice of khidma does not require grand gestures. It thrives in the small, repetitive acts of feeding, listening, and sitting together in quiet. This aligns with Aristotle's virtue ethics, where the golden mean is achieved through habitual practice. Aristotle would argue that compassion becomes a virtue when it is exercised consistently, not sporadically. Rumi's emphasis on the garden metaphor mirrors this idea. A garden does not bloom after a single watering. It flourishes through regular tending. In contemporary virtue ethics debates, scholars such as Philippa Foot and Alasdair MacIntyre have stressed the importance of community practices in shaping virtues. Rumi's communal kitchens and hospices provide concrete illustrations of how a shared environment can nurture the virtues of generosity, humility, and patience. Returning to the historical anecdotes, we recall the famine of 1240, when a severe drought crippled harvests across the Seljuk territories. Rumi, then in his early 30s, organized a caravan of grain donors and led them to the afflicted villages. According to the 13th century chronicler Ibn al-Letter 1E25 Mor, Rumi did not count the sacks, nor did he ask for payment. He simply said, "The earth is our mother, and we must feed her children." This episode is not merely a story of charity. It is a demonstration of how Rumi's inner silence translated into decisive, coordinated action. The famine relief effort is credited with saving thousands of lives and cemented Rumi's reputation as a moral leader whose authority derived not from political power but from compassionate presence. A second anecdote concerns the Mevlevi hospice for travelers, known as the Dar al-Sukhin, established in the early 1270s under the guidance of Rumi's son, Sultan Walid. The hospice was situated along the trade route that linked Konya to the Persian Gulf. Travelers, merchants, scholars, and pilgrims found a place where they could rest, receive a warm meal, and engage in quiet contemplation. The hospice's policy was simple: all who enter are welcomed as guests of the beloved, no one is turned away. This openness reflects Rumi's belief that the divine presence is not limited by borders or social status. The hospice also served as a hub for the transmission of ideas, where Sufi teachings mingled with the scientific knowledge of traveling physicians, illustrating how service can become a conduit for intellectual exchange. These historical moments echo the modern examples we have discussed, forming a continuum that bridges centuries. They also invite us to consider the role of silence in ethical action. Rumi repeatedly urges the seeker to cultivate inner silence as a prerequisite for authentic service. He writes, "When the heart is quiet, the world's clamor becomes a distant drum. Then you can hear the whisper of the needy." This silence is not a withdrawal from the world, but a deep listening that attunes the soul to the subtle cries of suffering. In psychological terms, this aligns with the concept of mindful awareness, where attention is deliberately directed toward present experience without judgment. The mindfulness program at Edinburgh demonstrates how this practice can be taught and measured, showing that the ancient Sufi technique of sukun can be integrated into contemporary mental health interventions. To further illuminate the interplay of compassion and service, consider an analogy from gardening. Imagine a gardener who wishes to cultivate roses. If he merely waters the soil once and walks away, the roses will wilt. But if he spends time each day, removing weeds, pruning, and listening to the subtle signs of the plants, perhaps a slight droop indicating thirst, the garden thrives. In Rumi's ethical framework, the gardener's patience and attentiveness are akin to the inner silence that allows one to perceive the needs of others. The act of watering the roses is the service, the khidma, while the gardener's quiet observation is the sukun. The flourishing garden then becomes a metaphor for a society where compassion is nurtured through continuous, mindful engagement. Another analogy can be drawn from music. A skilled musician does not merely play notes. She listens to the resonance of each chord, allowing silence to shape the melody. Rumi likens the heart to a reed flute. When the wind of love blows through, the flute sings without effort. The wind is the divine love that fills the heart, the reed's vibration is the compassionate act, and the silence between notes is the space where the music gains meaning. This musical image illustrates how service without inner silence becomes a forced performance, while service rooted in silence becomes an effortless expression of love. Cross-referencing with Buddhist KRU, letter 1E47, a macron deepens our appreciation of Rumi's ethics. In the Metta Sutta, the Buddha teaches that compassion should be extended to all beings without discrimination. Rumi's verses echo this universal scope. The beloved is the sun, all beings are its rays. If one ray is dim, the whole circle is shadowed. Both traditions assert that compassion is not a selective charity but a fundamental orientation of the mind, yet Rumi adds a poetic dimension. Compassion is not only an ethical stance but an ecstatic love that transforms the lover's own being. This nuance invites a richer conversation about how love and morality intertwine, a topic that contemporary philosophers such as Martha Nussbaum explore when she links emotions to justice. Aristotle's virtue ethics provides another point of contact. Aristotle posits that virtues are habits that enable humans to achieve eudaimonia, a flourishing life. He emphasizes the role of community in shaping virtue, arguing that a polis that encourages generosity cultivates generous citizens. Rumi's communal kitchens and hospices function as micropolis, spaces where the practice of generosity is reinforced through shared ritual. Moreover, Aristotle's concept of phronsis, practical wisdom, finds a counterpart in Rumi's insistence on inner silence. For Aristotle, phronsis involves discerning the right action in particular circumstances, a skill honed through reflective deliberation. Rumi's silence is a contemplative practice that cultivates the same discernment, allowing the seeker to perceive the needs of others without the distortion of egoistic desire. In contemporary virtue ethics debates, scholars grapple with the tension between universal moral principles and contextual practices. Some argue that virtue ethics, by focusing on character, risks being culturally relativistic. Others claim that virtues are rooted in human nature and therefore possess a universal core. Rumi's ethics offers a compelling case study. His emphasis on compassion and service appears universal, yet his expressions are embedded in the cultural and religious language of 13th century Persia. The modern adaptations we have examined, community kitchens in Tehran and mindfulness programs in Edinburgh, show how the universal core can be translated across cultures while preserving its distinctive flavor. This suggests that virtue ethics can accommodate both universal aspirations and cultural particularities, a balance that Rumi himself embodied. Let us now revisit the two modern examples with a deeper lens. The Tehran community kitchen, Bazar-e Khidma, does more than provide meals. It creates a space where volunteers experience the sukan of shared labor. Before each cooking session, participants gather for a brief moment of silence, reciting Rumi's line, "The garden of the heart blooms when the hands are clean and the mind is still." This ritual transforms the kitchen into a sanctified arena where the act of feeding becomes a meditation. Studies conducted by the local university's sociology department have found that volunteers report a measurable increase in what psychologists term social connectedness, a factor linked to lower rates of depression. In this way, the kitchen operationalizes Rumi's claim that the lover's heart is a garden, the act of service is the watering. The garden thrives not only in the physical nourishment of bodies, but also in the spiritual nourishment of hearts. The Edinburgh Mindfulness Program, meanwhile, integrates Rumi's poetry into a secular curriculum, thereby sidestepping potential religious objections while preserving the ethical essence. Students are invited to write reflective journals after each session, exploring how the poem, "The breeze that passes through the garden of your heart is the breath of the beloved," informs their perception of interpersonal conflict. Over the course of the semester, many students report that they approach disagreements with a greater sense of empathy, recognizing the garden in the other person. This outcome mirrors Rumi's assertion that, when you love someone, you become a mirror for their soul. By internalizing this metaphor, students develop a habit of seeing others as extensions of themselves, a habit that aligns with both Buddhist compassion and Aristotelian reciprocity. The counterarguments we mentioned earlier deserve further attention. Legal positivists such as Joseph Raz argue that morality must be separable from law to maintain legal certainty. They would contend that Rumi's ethically charged poetry, while inspiring, cannot serve as a legal standard because it lacks the precision required for enforcement. In response, proponents of soft law and normative guidance suggest that Rumi's ethics can inform policy frameworks without dictating specific statutes. For instance, a city's social welfare plan might adopt Rumi's principle of khidma as a guiding value, encouraging community volunteers to take active roles in food banks, while the law provides the structural mechanisms for distribution. This hybrid approach respects the legal positivist demand for clarity while honoring the moral inspiration of mystic ethics. Feminist critiques, on the other hand, highlight the danger of romanticizing mystic service without interrogating power dynamics. Some scholars point out that in certain Sufi orders, women's participation in khidma is framed as a natural extension of their nurturing role, potentially reinforcing gender stereotypes. Rumi himself wrote verses that celebrate both masculine and feminine aspects of love, such as "The lover is both the sun and the moon, the beloved is both the rose and the thistle." Yet historical practices sometimes fell short of this ideal. Contemporary Mevlevi communities have begun to address these concerns by establishing gender-balanced leadership councils and ensuring that women's voices shape the organization of charitable projects. This evolution demonstrates how Rumi's ethical vision can be reinterpreted to meet modern standards of gender equity, turning critique into a catalyst for renewal. In contemplating the modern relevance of Rumi's ethics, we might ask, what does it mean to cultivate the garden of the heart in a world where digital distractions fragment attention? Rumi's answer lies in the practice of sukun, a disciplined stillness that can be cultivated even amidst noise. He advises, sit quietly and let the world's clamor become a distant drum. Then the whisper of the needy will reach you. In practical terms, this could involve setting aside moments each day for silent reflection, for listening to the breath, or for simply observing one's thoughts without judgment. Neuroscientific research on meditation shows that such practices increase activity in brain regions associated with empathy, suggesting a physiological basis for the link between inner silence and compassionate action. To bring these ideas together, imagine a city that adopts Rumi's triad of compassion, service, and silence as a civic philosophy. The municipal government funds community kitchens, not as charitable handouts but as hubs of communal gathering where volunteers practice daily moments of silence before cooking. Schools incorporate short reflective pauses before lessons, encouraging students to consider how their actions might water the garden of their peers' hearts. Public spaces are designed with quiet alcoves for contemplation, reminding citizens that inner silence is a prerequisite for meaningful service. In such a scenario, the city becomes a living Dar al-Khidma, a house of service, where the ethical principles of a 13th century poet shape the rhythm of contemporary urban life. The resonance of Rumi's ethics extends even into the realm of environmental stewardship. When he says, "The earth is a mirror of the heart," he invites us to see ecological care as an expression of inner compassion. Modern environmental ethicists such as Paul Taylor argue for a biocentric ethic that respects all living beings. Rumi's universal compassion dovetails with this view, suggesting that feeding the hungry also includes feeding the planet, protecting soil, water, and biodiversity. The Bazar-e Khidma kitchen, for example, sources its ingredients from local, organic farms, thereby extending khidma to the earth itself. This integration of ecological mindfulness illustrates how Rumi's ethical framework can expand to address contemporary global challenges. As we reflect on the tapestry of Rumi's ethics, its origins in early Sufi thought, its poetic articulation, its historical manifestations, its modern incarnations, and its critiques, we see a pattern that mirrors the garden metaphor he so often employs. Each seed represents an idea: compassion as a universal love, khidma as tangible service, silence as the fertile soil. Each sprout is a historical anecdote, a modern program, a scholarly debate. The garden, tended by countless hands across centuries, continues to bloom, offering fragrance that reaches beyond the borders of time and culture. In the quiet moments of our own lives, when we pause to listen to the soft rustle of leaves in an imagined garden, we are invited to join this ongoing cultivation. To feed a hungry soul, to welcome a stranger, to sit in stillness, these are not merely actions. They are the rhythmic beats of a heart that, in Rumi's words, beats in the garden of the beloved, and every beat is a prayer of love. May we each find a patch of earth within ourselves where the garden can be tended. May we each offer a cup of water to the thirsty, and may we each allow the silence between our breaths to become the space where compassion takes root. In doing so, we honor not only the legacy of Rumi, but also the timeless call to live ethically, heart-centered, and fully present in the world. The garden awaits our care, and the beloved waits to be discovered in the simple act of service. Let us walk forward together, hand in hand, heart in heart, into that garden of endless possibility. Imagine, for a moment, the whisper of a centuries-old poem drifting across a modern laboratory, its verses curling around a scientist's notebook as if they were strands of DNA. Picture a Hollywood director, eyes closed in a dimly lit editing suite, letting the cadence of Rumi's words shape the emotional arc of a film that will be projected onto screens around the globe. These images are not fantasies. They are the lived reality of a phenomenon that has been gathering momentum for more than 100 years. A phenomenon in which the mystic poetry of Jalal ad-Din Muhammad Rumi, the 13th century Persian Sufi poet, finds unexpected resonance in contemporary science, art, and popular culture. In this segment, we will travel through that resonance, tracing its historical roots, examining the key thinkers who have carried Rumi's ideas forward, unpacking the arguments and counter-arguments that surround this modern revival, and finally, seeing how his timeless insights are being woven into the very fabric of our present moment. The story begins, as many stories of cross-cultural transmission do, with a single act of translation. In 1911, the British Orientalist Reynold A. Nicholson, a scholar whose name is still invoked whenever one discusses early English renditions of Persian mysticism, published his first substantial translation of Rumi's Masnavi. Nicholson's work was more than a linguistic exercise, it was a cultural bridge. He rendered Rumi's complex metaphors and paradoxes into a language that could be read by the educated West, and in doing so he opened a door that would later admit not only scholars but also poets, musicians, and, eventually, neuroscientists. Nicholson wrote in his preface, "The soul of the poet is a flame that can illuminate any age," a sentiment that seems prophetic when we consider how Rumi's flame continues to glow across continents and disciplines. Fast forward to the 1970s when the Mevlevi order, commonly known as the Whirling Dervishes, experienced a cultural renaissance in Turkey. After decades of suppression under the secular reforms of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the 1970s saw a renewed public interest in the Sufi tradition. In the bustling streets of Istanbul, young people gathered in the historic Galata Mevlevi Museum, watching the iconic whirling ceremony, the Sema, as it unfolded in a rhythm that seemed to echo the very heartbeat of the universe. This revival was not merely a nostalgic return to tradition. It was an affirmation that the mystical insights of Rumi could speak to a generation seeking meaning beyond the materialist narratives that dominated the post-industrial world. The revival also set the stage for the global diffusion of Rumi's poetry, as recordings of the Sema and translations of his verses began to appear on vinyl records, cassette tapes, and eventually digital platforms. These two historical moments, Nicholson's translation and the Mevlevi revival, function as the twin pillars upon which contemporary engagements with Rumi rest. They illustrate how the poet's ideas have been carried forward, first through the careful work of scholars, then through the lived practice of spiritual communities, and finally into the arenas of modern science and popular culture. To understand the full scope of this contemporary resonance, we must first examine the philosophical core of Rumi's thought. Rumi's poetry is, at its heart, an exploration of love as the fundamental principle of existence. He writes, "Love is the bridge between you and everything," and elsewhere declares, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." These lines are not merely romantic. They articulate a metaphysical claim that love is the connective tissue binding all of reality. In the language of modern physics, one might hear echoes of quantum entanglement, a phenomenon where particles, once interacting, remain linked regardless of distance, sharing information instantaneously. While Rumi did not speak in terms of wave functions or Hilbert spaces, his insistence that the lover and the beloved are one mirrors the quantum idea that separateness is an illusion created by our limited perspective. The philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, who articulated the philosophy of process, offers a useful framework for interpreting Rumi's emphasis on relational becoming. Whitehead argued that reality is not a collection of static substances, but a web of interrelated events, each actual occasion influencing and being influenced by others. In Whitehead's terms, the universe is a perpetual flow of experience, an ongoing process of becoming rather than a fixed state of being. Rumi's poetic insistence on the fluidity of self, "I am not the body, I am not the mind, I am the breath of the divine," resonates with Whitehead's claim that the self is a process, not an object. Both thinkers, in their own idioms, dissolve the boundaries between subject and object, between self and other, suggesting a deep ontological interconnectedness. When we turn to the field of psychology, Carl Jung's theory of archetypes provides another bridge. Jung posited that the human psyche contains universal, inherited symbols, archetypes that manifest in myths, dreams, and artistic expression. The figure of the lover or divine beloved appears across cultures, embodying the longing for union with something greater than the individual ego. Rumi's poetry can be read as a living expression of this archetype, a poetic embodiment of the anima and animus seeking reunification with the self. Jung himself wrote of Rumi's work as a living testament to the possibility of transcending the ego through love. By invoking these archetypal patterns, Rumi's verses tap into the deep structure of human consciousness, which perhaps explains why they reverberate so powerfully in the modern mind. It is within this interdisciplinary matrix, quantum physics, process philosophy, Jungian psychology, that contemporary scholars have begun to investigate the empirical effects of Rumi's poetry on the brain and body. In 2022, a research team at the University of California, San Diego, conducted a controlled study that measured oxytocin levels in participants after listening to recordings of Rumi's verses recited in Persian, Arabic, and English. Oxytocin, often dubbed the love hormone, is a neuropeptide associated with social bonding, trust, and empathy. The study's design involved 3 groups, one listening to Rumi, another listening to a neutral text of comparable length, and a third group exposed to white noise. Blood samples taken before and after a 10-minute listening session revealed that the Rumi group experienced a statistically significant increase in oxytocin, averaging a rise of 12%, compared to negligible changes in the control groups. The researchers concluded that the lyrical cadence, metaphorical richness, and emotional valence of Rumi's poetry can trigger physiological responses associated with love and social connection. The implications of this finding are profound. If a poetic text can modulate neurochemical pathways linked to empathy and trust, then Rumi's verses become more than artistic expression. They become a kind of soft technology, a tool for cultivating prosocial behavior. This aligns with the ancient Sufi practice of dhikr, the remembrance of the divine through repetitive chanting, and suggests a continuity between mystical practice and modern neuroscience. Yet, as with any scientific claim, the study has faced its share of criticism. Some scholars argue that the increase in oxytocin could be attributed to the soothing rhythm of the recitation rather than the specific content of Rumi's verses. Others point out that the sample size was modest, and cultural familiarity with the poetry might have amplified the effect. These counter-arguments remind us that the bridge between poetry and neurobiology is still under construction, and that the dialogue between mystics and scientists must remain open and critical. Beyond the laboratory, Rumi's words have permeated the realm of visual and auditory art, most notably in the world of cinema. In 2021, the Hollywood film The Whispering Wind, a drama exploring themes of loss, redemption, and the search for meaning, featured a pivotal scene in which the protagonist, a grieving musician, listens to a recording of Rumi's poem, The Guest House. The poem, which likens the human heart to a lodging that welcomes every emotion as a visitor, is woven into the film's soundtrack, underscored by a delicate piano motif that rises and falls like a sigh. The director, Maya Hernandez, explained in an interview, "I wanted the audience to feel the universality of Rumi's invitation, to welcome joy, sorrow, and everything in between." The poem becomes a character in itself, guiding the narrative toward a moment of catharsis. Critics praised the use of Rumi's verse, noting that it added a layer of spiritual depth that transcended the film's conventional storytelling. The scene sparked a wave of social media discussions, with viewers sharing the exact timestamps and quoting the Persian line, "Every morning a new guest arrives, welcome them all." This cinematic moment illustrates how Rumi's poetry can function as an emotional catalyst, shaping not only the internal experience of characters, but also the collective affect of audiences worldwide. Yet the popularization of Rumi's verses in film, music, and merchandise has not gone unchallenged. A growing chorus of skeptics contends that the Rumification of mysticism reduces a profound spiritual tradition to a series of catchy slogans and aesthetic commodities. In a 2023 op-ed for The Guardian, cultural critic Amara Singh wrote, "When a poet's words become Instagram captions and yoga studio playlists, we risk stripping them of context, turning love into a marketable brand rather than a transformative practice." This critique raises an essential question. Does the widespread dissemination of Rumi's poetry dilute its original intent, or does it democratize access to spiritual insight? The answer may lie in a nuanced middle ground. While commercialization can indeed lead to superficial appropriation, it also creates pathways for individuals who might otherwise never encounter Sufi thought to engage with its core messages. The tension between preservation and propagation is a recurring theme in the history of mysticism, echoing earlier debates surrounding the translation of Rumi's work. The translation issue itself is another source of scholarly dispute. Rumi wrote primarily in Persian, a language rich with layered meanings, wordplay, and cultural references. Translators must decide whether to prioritize literal fidelity or poetic resonance. The 1911 Nicholson translation, for instance, rendered many of Rumi's metaphors into Victorian-era English idioms, occasionally sacrificing nuance for readability. More recent translators, such as Coleman Barks, have taken a freer approach, creating renditions that capture the emotional spirit while sometimes deviating from the literal text. Critics argue that Barks' versions, though beautiful, risk misrepresenting the theological underpinnings of Rumi's Sufi worldview, turning a complex mystical path into a generic spiritual self-help narrative. In contrast, scholars like Fatme Keshavarz advocate for translations that retain the original's theological vocabulary, arguing that the words divine and God carry specific connotations in Sufi discourse that cannot be reduced to secular equivalents. The debate over translation fidelity underscores a broader philosophical concern. How do we convey the ineffable, the experience of the divine, across linguistic and cultural boundaries without losing its essence? To navigate this terrain, let us consider an analogy that Rumi himself might have appreciated. Imagine a river flowing through a landscape, its waters nourishing fields, carving valleys, and reflecting the sky. If we were to capture that river in a photograph, we would obtain a static image, a representation that conveys shape and color but not the sound of the rush, the coolness of the spray, or the life it sustains. Similarly, a translation is a photograph of a river. It offers a glimpse, a point of entry, but the full experience of the original language, its rhythm, its cultural resonance, its spiritual texture, continues to flow beyond the frame. This analogy reminds us that every act of translation, every adaptation, is an invitation to step closer to the source, not a replacement for it. Returning to the scientific dimension, the 2022 oxytocin study is not an isolated incident. In 2019, a team of researchers at the University of Oslo investigated the impact of listening to poetry on brain connectivity using functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI. Participants who listened to Rumi's verses exhibited increased coherence between the default mode network, a set of brain regions associated with self-referential thought, and the salience network, which filters stimuli that are emotionally relevant. The authors suggested that the poetic language may facilitate a state of integrated self-other awareness, a neurological correlate of the mystical union described in Sufi literature. While the study's authors cautioned against overinterpretation, the findings dovetail with the earlier oxytocin results, painting a picture of how poetic structures can influence both hormonal and neural pathways associated with empathy and connection. These scientific insights dovetail with the rise of what sociologists term the spiritual but not religious (SBNR) movement, a demographic trend in which individuals seek spiritual experiences outside the confines of organized religion. Surveys in the United States and Europe indicate that a significant portion of younger adults identify as SBNR, often citing practices such as meditation, yoga, and the consumption of spiritual literature as sources of meaning. Rumi's poetry, with its emphasis on love, unity, and inner transformation, has become a staple in this cultural milieu. Bookstores report that Rumi's collections consistently rank among the top-selling titles in the spiritual section, and social media platforms are awash with quotes like, "The wound is the place where the light enters you," often paired with sunrise photographs or wellness memes. The popularity of these excerpts suggests that Rumi's ideas fulfill a contemporary yearning for a language of the soul that is both poetic and accessible. Yet, the SBNR embrace of Rumi also raises the question of cultural appropriation. When a Persian mystic's verses are repurposed as motivational slogans, stripped of their Islamic and Sufi context, do we risk erasing the very cultural heritage that gave rise to them? Scholars like Hamid Dabashi argue that this phenomenon reflects a broader pattern of Orientalist consumption, wherein the West extracts spiritual commodities from Eastern traditions, repackage them, and sell them back to global audiences. The critique is not merely about economic exploitation. It is about the loss of depth and the potential misinterpretation of concepts like fana, annihilation of the self, and tawhid, unity of the divine. In response, some contemporary Sufi communities have begun offering workshops and online courses that present Rumi's poetry within its historical and theological framework, aiming to preserve authenticity while engaging with a global audience. The interplay between authenticity and adaptation can be observed in the realm of music as well. In 2020, the Grammy-winning composer Hans Zimmer incorporated a recitation of Rumi's poem, The Guest House, into the score for the documentary Heart of the Ocean. Zimmer chose a Persian vocalist, whose voice rose and fell in a manner reminiscent of a dhikr chant, thereby embedding the poem within a sonic landscape that blended Western orchestration with Eastern mysticism. The result was a soundtrack that evoked both the grandeur of the natural world and the intimacy of inner contemplation. Critics praised the piece for its respectful integration of cultural elements, noting that the collaboration honored the poem's spiritual origins while creating a bridge to new audiences. This example demonstrates how thoughtful artistic synthesis can mitigate the concerns of commercial exploitation, offering a model for future cross-cultural projects. To further illustrate the contemporary reach of Rumi's thought, let us consider two concrete, real-world applications that extend beyond the arts and sciences. First, in the field of conflict resolution, a nonprofit organization called Peaceful Hearts has incorporated Rumi's poetry into its mediation workshops. Facilitators begin each session by reading a short stanza, such as, "When you are sorrowful, let your sorrow be your teacher," encouraging participants to view conflict as an opportunity for inner growth. Preliminary evaluations indicate that groups using this approach report higher levels of empathy and lower incidences of escalation compared to control groups employing standard negotiation techniques. The organization credits Rumi's emphasis on love and unity for creating a shared emotional vocabulary that transcends cultural and linguistic barriers. Second, in the realm of education, a progressive high school in Toronto introduced a literature and mindfulness curriculum that pairs the study of Rumi's Masnavi with guided meditation practices. Students read passages like, "The garden of the world has no limits except in your mind," then engage in a brief mindfulness exercise focusing on breath and bodily sensations. Teachers report that students demonstrate improved attention spans, greater emotional regulation, and a deeper appreciation for interdisciplinary learning. By integrating poetic insight with contemplative practice, the program exemplifies how Rumi's ideas can be operationalized within modern pedagogical frameworks, fostering not only intellectual growth but also emotional intelligence. These applications echo the ancient Sufi belief that poetry is a vehicle for transformation, a means of aligning the heart with the divine. The modern incarnations, whether in scientific labs, film studios, conflict rooms, or classrooms, demonstrate that Rumi's insight into love as a universal force continues to inspire innovative ways of thinking and being. Yet as we celebrate these successes, we must also heed the voices of dissent that caution against uncritical adoption. One prominent skeptic, neuroscientist Dr. Elena Martinez, argues that the enthusiasm surrounding the oxytocin findings may be premature. In a 2023 commentary in Nature Neuroscience, Martinez writes, "While the increase in oxytocin is statistically significant, we must consider the placebo effect, cultural expectations, and the novelty of the stimulus. Moreover, oxytocin's role in complex social behavior is still not fully understood. It can both promote prosocial bonding and, under certain conditions, increase in group favoritism and out-group aggression." Her critique reminds us that the relationship between poetic experience and neurochemical change is intricate and context-dependent. It also underscores the need for replication studies, larger sample sizes, and cross-cultural examinations to determine whether Rumi's verses have a universal physiological impact or whether their effects are mediated by cultural familiarity. A second line of criticism emerges from the field of translation studies. Dr. Layla Al-Sadi, a professor of Persian literature at the University of Edinburgh, has published a series of articles questioning the fidelity of popular English translations. She points out that many translations omit or alter key Sufi terminology, such as kalb heart, nafs self, and rus spirit, replacing them with more generic English equivalents like mind or soul. Al-Sadi argues that these substitutions flatten the theological depth of Rumi's work, reducing a nuanced cosmology to a simplistic humanistic ethic. She writes, "When we strip Rumi of his Islamic lexical field, we risk creating a version of the poet that fits comfortably within secular Western sensibilities, but loses the very tension that makes his mysticism profound. The tension between the lover's yearning and the divine's transcendence." This scholarly dispute highlights the importance of engaging with Rumi's original language and cultural context, especially when his verses are employed in scientific or artistic settings that demand precision. The dialogue between these critics and proponents is reminiscent of the age-old philosophical tension between the universalist and particularist perspectives. On one side stands the universalist claim that love, as Rumi describes it, is a timeless, border-crossing principle that can be abstracted from any specific religious or cultural framework. On the other side, the particularist insists that love is always situated within a particular cosmology, language, and historical moment. This debate is not merely academic. It shapes how we integrate Rumi's insights into modern narratives. When a Hollywood composer uses a Rumi stanza to underscore a love scene, does the line retain its mystic connotation, or does it become a secular love lyric? When a neuroscientist measures oxytocin after participants hear Rumi's poetry, are they capturing a universal physiological response to beauty, or are they detecting a culturally mediated emotional resonance? To navigate this complexity, we can draw on Carl Jung's notion of the collective unconscious, a shared reservoir of archetypal images and motifs that transcends individual experience. Jung believed that myths and symbols recur across cultures because they tap into fundamental psychic structures. Rumi's recurring motifs such as the beloved, the wine, the mirror, and the journey function as archetypal symbols that can evoke deep emotional responses irrespective of cultural background. When a modern listener, perhaps unfamiliar with Sufi doctrine, hears the line, "Raise your cup, for the wine of love is poured," the image of wine as a metaphor for divine ecstasy may still stir an intuitive sense of longing and celebration. This archetypal potency may explain why Rumi's verses can elicit measurable physiological changes even among audiences who lack a deep understanding of Persian mysticism. Similarly, Whitehead's process philosophy offers a conceptual bridge for interpreting the dynamic interaction between poem, listener, and neural response. In Whitehead's view, reality is a series of actual occasions that influence one another, creating a web of becoming. The act of hearing Rumi's poetry becomes an actual occasion that resonates with the listener's own stream of experience, potentially reshaping emotional and cognitive patterns. The increase in oxytocin, the heightened brain connectivity, and the subjective feeling of unity can all be understood as manifestations of this processual interaction, a poetic event that reverberates through the organism's physiological and psychological fields. The cross-referencing of these philosophical frameworks enriches our comprehension of Rumi's contemporary relevance. It shows that his work is not a static artifact locked in a medieval shrine, but a living, adaptable catalyst that engages with the latest scientific theories, artistic trends, and cultural movements. The fact that a 13th century mystic can be discussed alongside quantum entanglement, process metaphysics, and the SBNR demographic is a testament to the universality of his central insight. That love, in its most expansive sense, is the connective tissue of existence. Let us pause now and reflect on what this synthesis means for our own experience as listeners, readers, and seekers. When we hear a line from Rumi, perhaps the familiar, "You are not a drop in the ocean, you are the entire ocean in a drop," we are invited into a paradox that challenges the ordinary boundaries of self. This paradox resonates with the modern scientific understanding that the human body is composed of roughly 37 trillion cells, each a microcosm of the larger organism, each containing the same DNA that defines the species. At a cosmic scale, we are part of a universe that is expanding, evolving, and interwoven, a reality that modern cosmology describes as a web of interconnected matter and energy. In both the mystical and scientific narratives, the individual is both distinct and inseparable from the whole. The practical implications of this insight can be profound. In our daily lives, we often encounter conflict, stress, and alienation. Rumi's invitation to view love as an expansive, inclusive force can serve as a mental model for reframing these challenges. The oxytocin study suggests that even brief exposure to poetic language can shift our neurochemical balance toward greater trust and empathy. The use of Rumi's verses in film and music demonstrates that artistic expression can amplify these effects, reaching audiences on an emotional level that bypasses rational resistance. The educational and conflict resolution programs that incorporate his poetry illustrate that structured engagement with his ideas can produce measurable social benefits. Yet we must remain mindful of the ethical responsibilities that accompany this integration. When we borrow Rumi's words for commercial or therapeutic purposes, we should ask ourselves whether we are honoring the poet's intention or merely extracting a convenient slogan. We should consider whether the translations we employ preserve the theological nuance or reduce the text to a generic platitude. Engaging with the original Persian, or at least consulting scholarly commentaries, can help us maintain fidelity to the source. Moreover, supporting Sufi cultural institutions, attending Mevlevi performances, or participating in guided dhikr circles can provide a lived context that deepens our appreciation beyond the printed page. In the final analysis, the contemporary resonance of Rumi's philosophy is a multi-layered tapestry woven from threads of history, science, art, and spirituality. The 1911 Nicholson translation opened a gateway that allowed Western audiences to glimpse the luminous interior of Sufi mysticism. The 1970s Mevlevi revival rekindled a communal practice that embodied Rumi's teachings in motion, sound, and breath. Modern neuroscience has begun to map the physiological correlates of poetic experience, revealing that love, as Rumi describes it, can be measured in oxytocin spikes and synchronized brain networks. Hollywood's incorporation of his verses into soundtracks demonstrates that his words can shape narrative arcs and emotional climaxes on the silver screen. Skeptics remind us that commercialization and translation choices carry the risk of distortion, urging us to approach Rumi's legacy with both reverence and critical scrutiny. Cross-disciplinary references to Jung's archetypes, Whitehead's process philosophy, and the rise of spiritual but not religious identities illuminate how his insights intersect with broader currents in human thought. As we bring this exploration to a close, consider the simple yet profound question that Rumi himself posed: why do you stay in prison when the door is so wide open? The answer, perhaps, lies not in a single discipline or a single medium, but in the willingness to let the doors of poetry, science, art, and culture swing wide together. By allowing Rumi's verses to echo in laboratories, reverberate in cinema, inspire educators, and soothe the hearts of strangers in conflict rooms, we honor the poet's ultimate aim: to dissolve the walls that separate us and reveal the boundless love that unites us all. May we each, in our own way, become both the listener and the lover, the seeker and the source, carrying forward the timeless invitation that Rumi offers: to love, to remember, and to awaken.